Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is March the 20th, 2022, and we're going to talk about the world, probably with the heavy emphasis on what's going on in Ukraine. I'm going to join Mr. Agent Smith in voice communication now. No, now. Now. Agent Smith.
Hello.
Hey. How are you doing, dude?
I'm doing okay.
We didn't have a last week because I had an emergency go see the Batman movie. But I made it out of that okay.
That's a good reason. I don't begrudge that at all.
Yeah. I'm kind of like you in that I'm almost completely a recluse unless someone's like, hey, come do this thing. And I'd be like, okay, fine. I haven't done a thing with people in like a month, so I am obligated to say yes to that.
Yeah. How was it?
It's a good movie. It's definitely one that is going to favor the patient viewer over the impatient viewer. The pacing is, it's more atmospheric and less dialogue driven. So it shows you a bunch of like panning shots of Gotham to really set the tone for the movie. And the movie's tone is very different from any of the other Batmans that I've seen. The Christian Bale Batman is very much like a super ninja where he's just like ridiculously competent with his acrobatics and his combat. He's hella strong. And it's about what he can do physically. He's still smart and has good tech and stuff, but that's like a very physically powerful Batman. And then you've got like the Michael Keaton Batman, which I feel like is strongest with the Bruce Wayne presentation. And then this Batman, the movie feels like a thriller or a horror movie for a lot of it, rather than an action movie. Like the evil people in the show, like what they're doing is like really fucked up, and the violence is like pretty fucked up. So it's not like the campy, the villain does a bad thing and then says a joke and everybody laughs. Like Jack Nicholson Joker was really funny to watch. But yeah, this villain is pretty spooky.
Well, that was the Riddler, right?
Yep, the Riddler's in this one.
Gosh, what is this? This is the third iteration now of the Batman franchise.
No, more than that. You've got the silly TV one that was live action.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
Adam West Batman, maybe. And then you have the Michael Keaton, he did 2 movies. And then Val Kilmer did 1 movie, Batman Forever, which he's pretty good. And then there was the George Clooney Batman, which was like the silliest one.
Well, all those 90s Batmans were basically just one universe, weren't they?
Yes.
Even if they had different actors.
Yes. All of those I think were meant to be kind of similar. I think the Michael Keaton one was different because it had a different director.
Yeah. And those were all kind of very different thematically from the ones in the... Who was it? Tim Burton that did those? Late 80s, early 90s?
Yep.
Yeah, that was like a whole different sort of perspective on it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's like how does the viewer feel at the end of it, which is interesting. After watching Christopher Nolan Batman, it gives you an oorah feeling. Like, we can do stuff. Batman is strong. Human nature is going to triumph over evil. You're like, yeah, kick ass. You finish this Batman movie and you're like, man, Gotham is fucked up. But it's good. The actor did a good job. I went into it like knowing almost nothing about Pattinson, and I think being able to play Batman in a way that doesn't overlap with the previous ones too much, but is still authentic and good is pretty tough to do, and I would give him a thumbs up.
Cool.
Oh, there's also the Ben Affleck Batman, which I always forget to mention that one because whenever I see that, I just see Ben Affleck in a batsuit. I've seen him in too many movies.
Yeah. He's been around the block a few times.
Mm-hmm. Chat's going wild about the bat nipples in the George Clooney one.
Yeah, the 90s movies were something else. Really good soundtracks. I think they got Hans Zimmer for those.
Yep.
So very memorable. But then some of the other aspects were a little tongue in cheek, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm old enough to have grown up with the Tim Burton ones, so that's kind of still Batman in the back of my head, like
Mm-hmm.
at a subconscious level.
Yeah. Those were good. We watched the original Batman of those two pretty often with the family.
It was just the two, right? There was Batman and then Batman Returns.
Yep. And Batman Returns had Catwoman and Penguin.
Yeah. Ooh, that was Michelle Pfeiffer, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, it's been a long time since I thought of her.
Michelle Pfeiffer.
Well, I'm
So
just kind of picking at my notes here while we're talking. How well did you do? Was there anything that you did the past week that was kind of, well, other than the movie?
yeah, I watch and browse more news now since there's active war and that's all kind of a thing. The main documentary item that I watched was, I can't remember, I think it might have been a PBS Frontline of Putin's war, and it was basically trying to look at the mindset of Putin over the course of his career, starting out as a KGB agent in Germany to the collapse of the Soviet Union to his rise to power. And that was pretty good. The context, I think, helps understand his image consciousness and his image management as a leader, which I would say is definitely one of his strong suits. Controlling your public's perception of yourself is massive for whether they choose to vote for you or not, what their confidence level is for you, and just what they think that you're good at, kind of a thing. There was a pretty formative moment for him, according to these people in the documentary, which was he's in Germany on assignment and the Soviet Union is collapsing, and he's there and he's asking them, hey, there are people protesting in the place where I'm an agent. What am I supposed to do? And they didn't have any assignment for him or whatever. And that was kind of,
Moscow is silent. Yeah, I do
yes.
remember that.
So there was that. And then he was under, who's the pro-democracy Russian president they had for a while? His name starts with a B.
Boris Yeltsin.
Boris Yeltsin. He ended up kind of slipping around through the ranks and stuff, just being a really ambitious man. And then Boris Yeltsin is rising to power and stuff, and Putin is in sort of a right-hand man to him role. And then Boris Yeltsin passes power to him or endorses him in some way that allows Putin to be the next leader. And apparently Putin was saying a lot of Boris Yeltsin's sentiments of like, yeah, democracy good. Like, we're going to try to give the Russian people a lot of freedom and democracy and stuff. And that was part of the battle, was the determining the soul of Russia after the Soviet Union collapses. Are we going to try to do something communist again? Are we going to try to do something democratic again? Or are we going to try to do some like czar shit, which seems to be more of what Putin actually wants to do with his reign and his rule. Is he's not trying to say, all right, how can we expand the freedoms of the public? How can we give them more of a voice? How can we have better institutions that are balanced and that check each other and try to do a more Western model? It's more of a, how can I consolidate power for myself and how can I expand my empire? And I think if you're looking at him and his motivations, not as president, but as czar, it like everything makes complete sense. I think he said the stuff to Boris Yeltsin to improve his station rather than that he authentically believed them himself.
Well, it's debatable that he really believes in much of anything. You know, it seems like he has a very sort of realist slash realpolitik perspective of foreign policy in particular.
Mm.
So it may be that he just expresses whatever views are necessary in order to expand and ensure Russian security.
I've heard that word used a few times, realpolitik. What is the quick definition of that? It's one word with a K for politic.
Yeah, it's a German word. It was sort of, I believe it was coined by Bismarck back in the late 19th century. And it describes a very hard-headed and somewhat cold-blooded perspective on the expansion of national power. So it really specifically refers to how Bismarck unified Germany and defeated sort of their Austrian rivals for leadership of the German-speaking world. And they did that through sort of, well, he did that specifically through hook and crook. He sort of instigated a war with France, in which he was able to use ostensible French aggression as a kind of excuse to unify the different German principalities together and rally them behind Germany. Well, rally them behind Prussia, rather, as opposed to Austria. And then there was a couple of wars of expansion against Austria itself, as well as Denmark, I believe. That was the Holstein War. And so all of that served to expand boundaries and solidify and centralize the new imperial German state. And yeah, he was very clever about it, but it was not like a very nice, bloodless process. Not a few lies were told in the process. The Franco-Prussian War in particular is the one that comes to mind because he basically wrote a series of letters to, what was his name? Napoleon III, I believe was Emperor of France at the time. He'd been elected and then just kind of immediately seized power for himself. French politics is nothing if not tumultuous. So he wrote a series of letters, I believe to him, or maybe it was a French diplomat, that was just really insulting and basically just instigated a conflict, more or less purposely. And then the Germans painted themselves as defenders, right, and the French as aggressors, so that they could use the war as an excuse to unify Germany. It was pretty smart. But yeah, that's sort of a case study in realpolitik. It's not about right or wrong, it's about achieving objectives by whatever means necessary.
Right. So realpolitik is the ends justify the means.
Yeah, so that's the Cliff Notes version. I should have gone with that.
No, that's my job. If you do that, then I have no job left.
You do quite a bit. You do quite a bit.
There was a question in the chat. Do you know about the influence of Dugan in Putin's ideology? I don't know who that person is. Dugin.
Alexander Dugan is a Russian philosopher whom has, over the course of his career, tried to construct not only a Russian identity in and of itself, but he's also tried to kind of engineer a new world order, or at least a vision for a new world order in which different civilizations run their own affairs without interference from others.
Mm-hmm.
So, in particular, he's kind of hung up on what you might call Anglo-Saxon civilization, which he sees as a cosmopolitan maritime civilization, which has inherently different values than Russia, which he sees as more of a sort of Eurasian Great Plains civilization, which is rooted in different values. And he believes that Russia, as well as other civilizational poles in the world, should become insular and segregate themselves from each other so that they can run their own affairs according to their own values. And he has a lot of nationalist sentiments that sort of define the Russian identity from his perspective. I haven't read his stuff, but I probably should at some point. But yeah, that's ostensibly a major influence on the Russian government and the Russian leadership as it stands right now, because a lot of those guys are Siloviki, national security guys, who tend to have a bias towards national security focused philosophies and perspectives. They already kind of think in nationalist terms, so some of Dugan's rhetoric kind of probably appeals to them. But the degree to which Dugan is informing decision making in the Kremlin is the subject of some debate. I've seen people kind of implicitly assume it's true, but then I've also seen people online saying that Dugan's influence is overblown and that there are other factors that are driving Moscow's decision making. So the degree of influence is debatable, as I understand it, but it is a factor, at least.
Certainly an ideology that Putin would find favorable for backing up his ambitions.
Yeah.
And that's a
If
big
nothing
part
else.
of choosing which ideology you favor as well. Is do you choose the ideology that ends up placing judgment upon yourself and pressure to change, or do you choose the one that says, yes, yes, keep going with that?
I mean, in Dugan's case, it's not even like a full-throated ideology. It's more like a set of policies, or more accurately, an excuse or rationalization of certain policies, specifically a policy of autarky, that being sort of economic self-sufficiency, as well as, I'm not sure quite what the right word would be, but let's say resisting Western values, which he sees as an imperative of the Russian state. So basically, just kind of blocking out foreign influence is an objective for him, and his reasoning is an excuse to do that, which inherently makes it appealing to national security types who maybe don't think in quite such spiritual terms about the Russian identity as Dugan does, but who definitely see value in self-sufficiency, because obviously if there's interdependence, then foreign partners or rivals can use that interdependence to pressure you to do things you don't want.
Is there anything else that I watched or read that jumped out at me? I did get an update from Bitter Sugar. He is still okay. He moved out of Kyiv, though, because it's like super noisy and still continuing to get bombed or whatever. And when you haven't had sleep for 2 weeks, it seemed like the right call for them.
Yeah, that's a good move. I was kind of hoping he would get out sooner or later.
Yeah, even if you're saying Ukraine has a chance at defending the city, it's going to be used more and more as like a war zone. So if you're a civilian, then it might not be the best idea to stick around.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm glad he's doing well. Let's see. Pulling stuff here. Did you have anything you wanted to kind of touch on? I mean, other than the obvious?
Don't think so.
Not sure. I'm sure our audience has been pretty active on social media, so there's some of this stuff that I'm going to talk about that they may already know. But for those of you who are busy, too busy to keep track of all this stuff on the regular, there might be some useful information for you. I guess think of it as a Ukraine update. Still kind of trying to pick and choose some stuff here. Yeah, there's just so much to pick through in any given week that I have a hard time synthesizing all of it. Okay, well, if there's nothing else. So let's see, what, 2 weeks ago, right, was the last time we did this. So well, when we left off anyway, I think it was the end of roughly the first week. And at that time, it was looking like the Russians were showing signs of trouble. You know, logistical problems, leadership issues, planning problems, what have you. And what I said last time is that if the Russians don't significantly pick up the pace, then there's going to be, well, basically that'll solidify and prove, you know, the criticisms of the Russian army, such as they were at the time, that they were not able to conduct sophisticated operations, and that their logistical issues were something more than a minor fluke. And since that time, the pace has not improved. The Russian army has gotten bogged down on certain fronts. It's made some progress in others, but overall, the Russian performance has been very flawed, to put it mildly. And at this point, it looks like it's not just a temporary thing or something that's just a result of the bad planning at the beginning of the invasion, at this point, they should have been able to adapt better to conditions. So it seems like there's a lot of deep institutional problems within the Russian military at this point that are severely hobbling their ability to prosecute this war. And those speak to some, again, deeply rooted issues there that we didn't really know about. We guessed at them. I've heard people criticize the Russian military for corruption and being inept at certain key areas, key aspects of warfare. But now that they're kind of out in the open, they're pretty clear for everybody to see now. It's not really debatable.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is thinking about what spending is meant to do and what corruption means. So, for an example, and this is guessing, I don't have proof of this, if you are the person who is passed along a huge sum of money and said, here, take this, upgrade the tanks. You can take this, and if you're corrupt, you don't upgrade the tanks. You take that money and you spend that money because that's your money. They just handed it to you.
Yeah.
It's not where it was intended to go, but if you have it, there's the choice there.
Yeah, and that behavior is more or less normalized, in a corrupt political culture. It's expected that you do that. In fact, you can get in trouble if you don't do that, because it's expected that, your underlings are going to abuse their position. And so with that assumption, you basically extort them. If they want promotion or something, then you'll demand payment to some degree. And you expect them to have a pretty decent amount of money on hand because of the corruption you assume they're engaging in.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're an underling and you want to get promoted, but you're not corrupt, that puts you at a severe disadvantage, because whether you're corrupt or not, your superior is assuming that you are, and he's making demands of you in terms of financial payments in exchange for allowing you to progress in your career path. So if you're not corrupt, then how do you meet those demands? Because your pay isn't going to be nearly enough to meet those demands. So at that point, you pretty much just have to participate in the corrupt system, whether you want to or not. And then, of course, there's repercussions if you try to be a whistleblower or some such. There may not even be such a mechanism in place that you can use. And if they find out who you are rather, then there can be potentially even violent repercussions. So, yeah, it's thoroughly corrupt, and it's very difficult to not get wrapped up in that system, whether you want to or not. So, yeah, that is definitely one of the contributing factors here to the Russian military's poor performance. A lot of critical goods and services are just not provided for one reason or the other.
So we talked some about the issues. One of them was the environment and the time of year. So it's like swamp season, somewhere between winter and spring, where it's not snowy and it's starting to melt, which means that it's like the very worst conditions for driving tanks around. So they're forced to be on roads or they're going to get stuck off-road. And they also have to keep their engine on for long periods of time just to make sure that it doesn't freeze over or have other problems due to the weather.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the rainy season, which is called Rasputitsia, which is something that people will remember if they've ever studied the Eastern Front in World War II. That was a pretty big factor there as well that played a significant role in hobbling the German military's war effort.
Mm-hmm.
So it was then, and so it is again. It's another invading army getting caught up in the mud. You'd think they would have known better, but apparently not. Let's see. So the Ukrainian government has been releasing a lot of information, just as part of its sort of public relations campaign, and I'll try to talk a little bit about that later, but one of the things they released was a recording, allegedly, that was taken from some Russian soldiers who were calling family members. And, basically there's evidence of looting for the most part, and then talking about how badly things are going. as well as one guy who talked about killing some Ukrainian POWs, which was a bit incriminating, to put it mildly. So that was a pretty interesting listen. And I just bring it up because I'll send it to you, or I wanted to send it to you anyway. Let's see, Neuro. Oh. Let me just grab that real quick. And I've tried to post some of this stuff on YouTube, but YouTube doesn't really like comments that have links in it. So I've been unable basically to post anything in response to some of the questions we've gotten about some of the links that we post on here during the actual segment here on Twitch. So my apologies to the YouTube listeners. Well, another point here I wanted to kind of get to, one of the questions that I've seen kind of raised by some of the critics of Ukraine and the Western perspective on the war is why Western media didn't report more on the shelling of Donbass. You know, after the two separatist republics tried to break away from Ukraine after 2014, there was 8 years where there was intermittent fighting on that ceasefire line. And critics suggest that the media in the West is hypocritical for not covering that more. So the real answer to that question is because people in the West don't really care much about Ukraine, or at least they didn't before the recent conflict. So there wasn't really much impetus to cover it. But beyond that, the reason they didn't cover it is because it wasn't really one-sided. It wasn't just the Ukrainian army shelling the separatist side of the ceasefire line. There was firing. There were ceasefire violations on both sides over the past 8 years, and so the idea that it was just the Ukrainian army, you know, disrupting the lives of the residents of Donbass is not really a complete picture of what was happening. There was also people who were being shelled by the separatists who were having their lives disrupted. So it's not really fair to focus on just the one, basically. And then there's been the question in the West about why people in the West don't care as much about other conflicts as they care about the war in Ukraine. You know, so that seems like hypocrisy to a lot of people. And you know, I think the answer to that is just that every conflict is unique. Every conflict has its own context and historical background. So, in particular, people kind of point to Syria, for example. And you know, the reason people have not been invested in Syria is because of the war on terror, which has created a very negative impression among Western audiences of the Middle East and Middle Eastern conflicts. So I remember when the civil war in Syria was still a relatively new conflict way back in the day, and the impression that I saw online by a lot of people is that there weren't really any factions in Syria fighting for liberal democracy. Their impression is that it was an authoritarian Assad regime fighting against Islamist terrorists. And from their perspective, they didn't really see any benefit to supporting either side, and really pushed hard for the United States to just stay out of it completely. So that was certainly a major factor, and that was also a factor in why people in Europe were so resistant to taking in immigrants from Syria. You know, there was an association there with terrorism and what would you call it? Cultural incompatibility, I guess. That was a broad-based sentiment on the political right, or at least among some segments of the political right in Europe. So that being the case, then, not nearly as much investment by Western audiences than in the conflict. Whereas with Ukraine, it's just a very different dynamic. You know, there's no association with terrorism there. You know, there's a perceived liberal democratic activist movement in Ukraine that seems to be making gains. You know, that seems to be at least relatively successful in pushing the country in a relatively good modern direction. And that being the case, there's just a lot more sympathy there inherently, just for that reason. And also, it's worth pointing out that most people don't really pay attention uh, to these conflicts. So they don't really know, in a lot of cases, the context. And for those people, when they hear about a civil war in the Middle East, they kind of shrug it off because that's just kind of normal. People think colloquially and amongst the broader common population that civil wars in the Middle East are just normal. So nobody really pays much attention to it. Uh, but a state on state war, an international conflict like that between Russia and Ukraine is just inherently different. Europe's been at peace for 50 years, other than the Yugoslav collapse in the early 1990s. You know, Other than like, well, there's been some terrorism and stuff, but like full-on conflicts have been pretty rare for the most part. So to have this kind of war in Europe now is itself a break with precedent and is quite shocking, especially for people in Europe, given what Etche Fatum was telling me. So that's also part of the reason there's been a different response.
Yeah, greater integration with the West means that a lot more of their stories and voices are heard. Like whenever the Syrian war is happening, I don't think I had viewers who stepped up and talked to me about it, and it wasn't quite as close to home, I guess. So the danger of war and perceived danger of war for people is, I think, partly just a product of distance. How close is this conflict to home for you? And this conflict in Ukraine is very close to home for a lot of people. It is at home for some people who are completely connected to the West. Maybe English is their second or third language. Mm-hmm. So they're browsing a lot of the same stuff and running in a lot of the same circles. Yeah, it is true, though, that we're not like perfectly ethically fair between how we're giving aid to various countries and stuff. The Ukraine conflict definitely has more Western attention to it than the Iraq war or the Afghanistan war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a lot less. Well, rather, there's definitely a lot more cultural proximity between Ukrainian culture and Western cultures. So it's just inherently easier for people to kind of empathize. Mm-hmm. Ideally, they would be able to empathize with everybody, but that's just not the world we live in. People inherently are generally kinder and more able to connect with people whom they have more in common with. Mm-hmm. So that's just sort of an innate fact of life. It's also worth mentioning, too, that one of the reasons European governments care more about it, if not Western governments in general, is because there is a security commitment in Europe that doesn't really exist in the Middle East. The United States and Western Europe don't have any treaty alliances in the Middle East. I mean, well, other than Turkey anyway, but as far as Syria, Iraq, whatnot, well, the U.S. was responsible for Iraq. Maybe that's not the best example, but in the case of Syria anyway, it was seen as being more of a Middle Eastern problem. And given all the difficulties that the United States in particular had in places like Iraq, if not also Libya, there was a pretty strong aversion to jumping in. And Europe didn't even really have the capacity to jump in, but that's kind of another conversation. But with Europe, the United States has a security commitment to Western Europe and a good chunk of Eastern Europe. So even if Ukraine is not in NATO, the fact that Russia is becoming more aggressive, such that they would invade a neighboring state like this, has broader repercussions for the United States. If they invaded a country in Central Asia, for example, the U.S. wouldn't care. We have no security commitments there at this point, especially after withdrawal from Afghanistan. So it wouldn't really be something to get too excited about. But because Ukraine is right next to treaty allies, that means the United States has to do more, regardless of what it feels about, Ukraine and the circumstances thereof. There was inherently going to be a need to reassure allies and to show and prove that the United States would be willing to support its allies in the event of future aggression. So that's also another factor here, why the United States and the West are just inherently more invested. It's a lot more impactful to European security than it is than, say, the Syrian civil war. And that means more because we have a stronger commitment to European security than we do to Middle Eastern security. What else do we have here? So have you been following the war at all? Like in terms of the actual fighting?
Some of it, yeah. I've looked at some maps of like what territory is being taken. You mentioned the
State.
war game and how one of the win examples was like taking a series of just turtling up on one of the particular cities, which seems like Ukraine so far has also been doing successfully.
Yeah,
It's this,
Kharkiv.
yes.
Yeah, they wanted to kind of drag them into a prolonged fight for the city. And they've not succeeded in drawing the Russians into the city. The Russians seem to have largely redistributed their forces away from Kharkiv at this point. Fighting is ongoing, and they're still shelling the city, but it seems that the Ukrainians have been pretty successful at stopping and defeating Russian advances on the city, such that the Russians have failed thus far to surround the city and isolate it, like they have some of the other cities that they've managed to bypass. Actually, they haven't even been able to bypass Kharkiv yet. They haven't even gotten that far. So Ukrainian defenders in Kharkiv are doing a bang-up job. That's definitely one of the more successful areas for the Ukrainian military. I'm going to try to send you there's a website that has a live update map of Ukraine. And this is like one of the primary sources that people in the media have been using to kind of track goings on. There we go. So if people are interested, they can take a look at this. Actually, if you're a YouTube listener, then I'll just tell you the URL. It's liveuamap.com. So if you go there, then you can see a pretty decent outline of who controls what territory, as well as some updates about on-the-ground reports of what's going on.
I posted it in Twitch chat.
Thank you. Yeah, this is definitely one of the better sources out there. Well, let me see here. So going back to 2 weeks ago, I'll just kind of run through some of my notes from then. So there was speculation that Russia maybe didn't even have the manpower or the logistical capacity to either seize Kiev or, more interestingly, to surround it and cut it off. It had been broadly assumed at the start of the war that surrounding and isolating Kiev would be something the Russian military would strive to do and would eventually succeed to do. But the longer things go, the more it seems like they kind of just can't do that. So that'll definitely have major repercussions for the course of the fighting. I mean, if Kiev were to be cut off, then it would just be a matter of time, basically, before the defenders were starved out. If they can't get supplies in, then it's just a matter of time. But if they can actually hold their supply lines open by preventing the city from being surrounded, then they can last maybe indefinitely if they can manage to fend off determined thrusts by the Russian military anyway, which thus far they seem to have managed to do. So that was one of the big questions from 2 weeks ago, whether or not the Russians even have the capacity to surround the city, and it seems not. So that suggests the city will be able to continue to stand as the capital of Kiev and the center of resistance. And it's worth mentioning, too, that most of Russia's forces in Ukraine are weighted in the north of the country, north of Kiev. So that's definitely sort of their main axis of advance, or at least it was. So the fact the Ukrainians have been able to fend that force off is significant. It says something. Let's see. So there has been some adaptation by the Russians. It hasn't been just all bad. From what I was reading anyway, 2 weeks ago, they've started to rotate the conscripts they sent in illegally out of the country, or at least into rear echelon roles away from the fighting. So that will hypothetically improve the quality of the troops that are actually doing the fighting, since they're not going to be, 19-year-old kids who don't have any combat experience and who didn't even think they would be fighting because, again, That's illegal. Russia itself has a law that they're not supposed to send conscripts into war. Uh, so I don't blame them for not being the most combat effective forces. Now, at the same time, one of the things I read 2 weeks ago and something that I've been reading updates on since that still seems to be true, it looks like the Russian military is starting to have manpower problems, which sounds weird because, everybody thinks of Russia as being a country that's just a bottomless pit of manpower. But, in practice, that isn't how it works. For one, they don't really want to mobilize all of their reserves because that would be a huge logistical strain. And their logistics are already stretched thin. Like, even if they could get all their reserves into Ukraine, it's not really clear that they would be able to supply them with food and ammunition. But at the same time, the regular forces, which are the ones that at this point seem to be doing most of the fighting, don't seem to be pulling their weight. They don't seem to be making much headway. They've taken enough casualties that the Russian government is starting to scrape the barrel, so to speak, in order to try to find anybody and everybody they can who can go to Ukraine and fight. So they've already recruited a number of Syrian mercenaries that they're going to send into the conflict. I think the number that I saw quoted last was something like 16,000. And they've also sent in Wagner Group mercenaries, which they were already doing, but it looks like they're trying to send more. They already had Chechens on the ground as well. They've already pressured some of their CISTO allies to contribute troops, like Kazakhstan and Armenia, but I don't think anybody has actually affirmed that request yet. It seems that all of them have said no. So it doesn't look like that's a likely source of reinforcement at this point, although that could change in future depending on how much pressure Moscow brings to bear on them. But for now, it's looking like it's mostly going to be Syrians who are the principal reinforcement. They're also trying to call up some of their reserves. I've seen reports that they're trying to do it secretly, but I don't think that's going to work. But it's not clear how effective those reserves will be, given, again, that they're mostly younger guys who don't have any combat experience. So we'll see how the Russian military manages the manpower shortage. It could be that attrition is sufficient by itself to kind of halt the advance. Let's see, another form of adaptation here. They've started, at least in the northeastern part of Ukraine, to redistribute their forces to the east of the country. Well, not redistribute to the east of the country. Rather, they're redistributing forces away from the front line towards their supply lines. One of the problems the Russians have had is that the Ukrainians have been hitting their supply lines really hard, such that it's very difficult to get supplies to the front line. So they've started, it seems, to dedicate some more of their forces to trying to secure those supply lines. That's going to help them get supplies to the front, but the downside is that their front isn't going to have as many forces available for any kind of forward advance. So that's the trade-off that they have. So the Ukrainians ideally will be able to exploit that, and hopefully will be able to defeat that smaller advance when it arrives. So let's see. Again, that was just northeastern Ukraine that I read that. So it could be that other parts of the front, other fronts in Ukraine rather, have not really started to address the supply line issue. So it may be that the Russian supply chains continue to be vulnerable in that regard in other areas.
I was thinking about it kind of strategy-wise and how Russia has a lot more stuff in a lot of categories, but you still have to like win the ground in addition to pushing the air. Like, as an example, Russia has way more fighter planes and some more modern ones too that are really nice, but they're not just like mass sending the best of the air force that Russia has straight away, because you need ground support so the planes don't just get shot down by much cheaper defense systems.
Well, I mean, what they need to do is to suppress Ukraine's air defenses, and that's possible, but it's complicated because you need to have, I mean, suppression of air defenses is a whole type of operation by itself. It involves multiple aircraft. It involves drones, anti-radiation missiles. It's a very technical process. And from what I've read, it seems that the Russians just don't really have that capability. They hypothetically, they do technically have the necessary equipment, anti-rad missiles. They have enough aircraft, but from what I was reading, they just don't have the ability to stage and organize and command maybe large flights of aircraft that are dispatched all at the same time. So the command and control capacity just doesn't allow that, basically, and that means that their ability to suppress air defenses is very limited. Which again is a surprise. Like we would have, I mean, it was just broadly assumed that they would be able to do that in like the first week, and it just hasn't happened. So yes, you need ground support, but really the Air Force should be able to secure air support superiority by itself. So the fact that they haven't is really, well, it says a lot about the lack of ability on the part of the Russian Air Force in terms of command and control, in terms of planning and organization, etc., etc.
Yeah, the image management of Russia in terms of looking like a super strong military power, I think, has been really good. And they do have nukes too, which is part of the reason why the countries in the West aren't just like jumping into the fray right away. I feel like that would have been something that happened sooner. Is we're not putting boots on the ground because that's a major escalation, and we're worried they would escalate a step further than that. Whereas if you're looking at other wars, say in the Middle East, that wasn't a threat on the table.
Yeah, the nuclear umbrella that Russia has is their principal deterrent at this point. If it wasn't before, it damn sure is now. The piss poor performance of their conventional forces is not going to have a deterrent effect in the short to medium term.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, if not for the nuclear umbrella, we would definitely be doing more, I would say. Well, let's see here. 2 weeks ago, there was some rumors that Belarus might get involved in the conflict. As is, they're basically just a staging ground for Russian forces pushing on Kiev. But there were rumors that the Belarusian military itself would also be mobilized and intervene. And there was also some movement spotted of Russian military forces deployed in the western part of Belarus. And it looked like they, perhaps in conjunction with the Belarusian military, might push southwest into western Ukraine in an effort to try to cut off the eastern part of Ukraine from supplies from Europe. But it never happened. And from what I've been reading, it doesn't seem like it's likely to happen. It seems that that's off the table. I'm not entirely sure why. It could be that the Lukashenko government is concerned about sanctions, because as is, Belarus has been targeted with a lot of the same sanctions as Russia, but if he deepens involvement, he could be targeted with more. So it seems there is some deterrent effect there in terms of Belarus's involvement. I've also been reading, although it's kind of hard to confirm, but I've also been reading that people in the Belarusian military are very opposed to involvement in the war, and that it's possible that that's also having an effect. It could be that Lukashenko doesn't feel that he can send the military into Ukraine or order them to do so without some kind of significant backlash, perhaps even a military coup. It's also worth mentioning that there's been a lot of weird shit in Belarus over the past couple weeks that nobody seems to be able to explain.
Like what?
Well, the main example is that there was explosions heard in a multitude of cities in southwestern Belarus. And I got the impression that they were just different explosions in each city that people were hearing. But nobody really had an explanation. And there were some rumors that maybe the military was staging a coup, but days later, nothing came of it. So it seems that maybe it wasn't anything. But obviously, there was something. So the explanation that the Belarusian government gave is that it was military exercises, but I don't know. That seems like it would be weird, because again, the explosions were heard in multiple different cities. So something happened, but we don't really know what. So that's just something else to kind of have in the back of your head. That the political situation in Belarus at this point is not stable. There's still a lot of people that are pretty upset about the suppression of the protest movement back in 2020. And so between that and discontent in the Belarusian military, the Lukashenko government may not be willing or able to do more than what it's currently doing in support of the Russian invasion. And it could be that there is unrest or even a revolution at some point in the coming weeks. It's not clear. But that's something to keep an eye on anyway. And one of the things I wanted to point out 2 weeks ago is that I noted a decided shift in tone on the part of analysts online that I was reading. In the first couple of days of the conflict, people were impressed with the degree to which the Ukrainian military was fighting, but the assessment was that it was just a matter of time before the Russian military overran the country. 2 weeks ago, though, that sentiment had shifted, and people were starting to talk about a potential pathway to victory for Ukraine. They were still overall pessimistic, but they started to see a possible avenue through which Ukraine could conceivably stalemate the Russian army or even win. And at this point, a week after that, it seems that those sentiments were justified. I would point out that even though the Ukrainian military is, outshining all expectations, and at the same time that the Russian military is underperforming, to put it mildly, at the same time, that doesn't mean that it's inevitable that they're going to win. The situation is still very much in doubt. The Russian military could rally, or the Ukrainian military could collapse. We've talked a lot about the Russian military's failings, but it's quite possible that the Ukrainian military has its own difficulties that just haven't been as well publicized. So it's entirely possible the whole, what's the word I want? The momentum of the conflict could change dramatically, very quickly, in the near term. That's possible. It seems likely that the Russian military will continue to struggle, just given what we've seen, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be ejected from Ukrainian territory, or that they won't win some victories in the future. So even if things stalemated like right now, Russia still controls a good chunk of Ukraine at this point, and that would give them significant leverage in any peace talks. So ideally, the Ukrainian military will get more supplies from the West, will mobilize more troops, and will be able to leverage those advantages into some kind of counteroffensive that will be able to either push the Russians out entirely, or at least significantly curtail the Russian presence on their territory. But that's a tail event. That's relatively unlikely at this point. Right now, we're just kind of hoping for stalemate and then possible reversals in different parts of the front. So room for optimism, but don't get too carried away.
There was a question in the chat about potential peace talks. I don't really know what the concessions would be, because it's like this conflict started out where Ukraine is a sovereign nation, so for them to give up any territory at all is something that they don't want to do. Their country does have an east-west political split, and also just an ethnic split. You have more ethnic Russians, people who spoke Russian as their first language, who are in the east, and they vote along those lines too. So it's not really like there aren't people who aren't favorable to Russia in Ukraine. I guess the question then is, if they did peace talks, what would either side give up for the conflict to end? Would they even agree to anything? Because I feel like Putin doesn't want to lose, and any outcome that makes it seem like he got the worst end of it, he's not going to be happy about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Russians are trying to avoid humiliation here at the same time that they're trying to pursue their original goals. So they're going to double down, and the fighting will probably continue for another several weeks at least, while the Russians try to mobilize whatever reserves they can get to the front and supply, and at the same time try to hammer Ukrainian cities to try to take those to free up forces for fighting in other parts of Ukraine. And I don't know if it's going to work. It seems unlikely, but they're going to try at least. So yeah, I don't think peace talks in the short term are going to go anywhere. I think there needs to be clear momentum for one side or the other for that to even begin to be feasible. And right now, the Ukrainians are still very much in defense mode, just kind of trying to stem the onslaught. That said, from what peace talks have occurred thus far, the consistent Russian demands and the ones that are substantive involve recognition of Crimea as a part of Russia, as well as recognition of the independence of the two separatist republics in the east of Ukraine. There's also been talk about demilitarization, which will involve probably some kind of caps on the size of the Ukrainian military, as well as limitations as far as what kinds of equipment that they can have. But the details of that haven't really been leaked yet, so it's not clear. And the Ukrainians are obviously very, very resistant to any notions of demilitarization, so it's not clear if there's going to be any progress on that.
Man, they're not going to fall for that again. The original agreement was for them to give up a bunch of nukes, and the UK, the United States, and Russia would protect them.
Yeah, the Budapest Memorandum.
And now we all know how that turned out.
Well, not too surprising. I mean, the commitment was always, well, paper thin, so to speak. So no shock that it didn't end up really being the deterrent that they would have liked. But also, they were never going to keep the nukes anyway. They just didn't have the capacity. I'm sure, given recent events, they would have liked to have developed the capacity, but it just wasn't really feasible at the time. But yeah, Russian security commitments are not really worth the paper they're written on at this point. So I don't think any kind of quid pro quo on that count is going to be very acceptable to the Ukrainian side. Also neutrality, that's another thing. I had some negotiations notes here. I'm kind of looking through them. So the Russians are insisting on some degree of neutrality on the part of Ukraine. But the extent of that neutrality is still subject for debate. It seems like the Zelensky government in Ukraine is kind of okay with neutrality. They seem to be willing to concede that, but the actual details of it are still very much in doubt. So I imagine that the Russians are going to want a pretty broad neutrality on the part of the Ukrainians. For example, some kind of constitutional amendment that enshrines it within the Ukrainian legal system, and which prevents them from joining groups like NATO specifically, if not also any other potential defense pact they might sign. But the Ukrainians are probably going to push for something more like a light neutrality agreement. Maybe not even a constitutional amendment, but rather just an agreement not to join NATO. The Russians probably won't like that because that's a really narrow agreement that would not necessarily preclude a bilateral defense treaty between Ukraine and, say, the United States and France and the UK, for example. So narrow neutrality versus broad neutrality seems to be one of the sticking points in the negotiations thus far, and we'll probably see more back and forth on that count that will probably reflect facts on the ground. But beyond that, I think at the very least, unless Russia is just outright completely defeated in Ukraine, which, seems unlikely, at the very least, Russia will probably get Crimea. They're probably going to get at least that much. Maybe Donetsk and Luhansk, I don't know. It could be the people, because there's only about half of Luhansk and Donetsk provinces were ever actually controlled by the separatist republics. The other half of the provinces remained part of Ukraine. And even if people in, Luhansk and Donetsk in the Ukrainian-held parts were sympathetic to Russia after 2014, if not before, I think Russia has kind of wasted a lot of that goodwill at this point. Not just because of the invasion, but also the quality of life in the separatist republics they set up has not been very good. There were high expectations in Donetsk and Luhansk that the Russians would increase pension payments and help supercharge their economy, with new investment and whatnot, and pretty much none of that happened. What the Russians did do was to set up two authoritarian statelets that did not tolerate dissent and basically were de facto one-party states with correspondingly, humane approaches to dissent, i.e. not very. So, I mean, basically they just weren't very attractive places to live. And a lot of the younger population ended up leaving, specifically because of that, if not also because of the lack of economic opportunity. So I don't know if even the people in western Donetsk and Luhansk would be willing to live in a new independent, People's Republic of Luhansk or People's Republic of Donetsk, as the case may be. But it may not matter what they want. It may be that, just the terms of the peace kind of force it on them. But regardless, that'll be whether or not they become recognized as independent states by Ukraine. That's going to be a part of the negotiation going forward. Everything else is highly suspect. Demilitarization, token denazification. One of the things I read is that the Ukrainian government would be happy to just take token bullshit measures to pretend to tackle Nazism in Ukraine, because it doesn't really matter. They can just give that as a kind of propaganda victory to the Russians. So there's a lot of superficial bullshit like that has been going on. The Ukrainians probably will be happy to give concessions on that because it doesn't actually cost them anything.
And we promise, as proof of our efforts toward denazification, to have a Jewish president. Oh, wait, that's done already.
Yeah, there's probably some other token things they could do. They could write laws, banning Nazism, or, I don't know, set up an NGO. I mean, there's lots of token bullshit you can do. There's a whole spectrum there. But the substantive stuff is going to be Crimea, separatist republics, and demilitarization and neutrality. And I suspect Crimea is almost certainly going to go to Russia. They'll almost certainly get that. Mm-hmm. Separatist republics and neutrality is very debatable. It just depends on sort of the terms. And then demilitarization is going to be significantly watered down if it ends up being conceded at all. But yeah, that's pretty much where the negotiations are at as far as I understand them. I guess that brings us up to this week. I guess I won't get too much into the combat details just to save time. I've got a kind of review of just kind of what's been happening on the ground, but I guess the highlights are, for one, the siege of Mariupol. I think everybody knows about that by now. That's been covered pretty heavily by the news. The city's been pretty much completely surrounded. And it's a pretty decent-sized city, about 500,000 some before the war. So there's a significant humanitarian toll being inflicted there. But for now, at least, the Ukrainians have been able to hold out. We'll see for how long, but they're doing okay at the moment. There's also the Battle of Izium. So this is in the east of the country. There was a column, I guess, of Russians that advanced from the northeastern border southwest into Ukraine. And they'd been advancing for a while, but they hadn't really met a whole lot of resistance. So they took a pretty significant chunk of territory. But eventually they got hung up on the city of Izium. So there's been prolonged heavy fighting around the city for the past week. So that's turning into a pretty significant point of resistance there. Oh, and do you remember the big convoy that was northwest of Kiev?
Mm-hmm.
So that's still pretty much just stuck northwest of Kiev, but I did read that the vehicles had dispersed away from the traffic jam into surrounding sort of woods and whatnot. At first, there was some question as to whether or not they were trying to advance westward, or maybe were trying to find a way to circumvent Ukrainian defenses, but it seems that they were basically just taking cover in order to avoid being attacked from the air. So they're still stuck up there, but they're not quite as vulnerable as they were when they were just stuck on the road. Let's see. Overall, the past week, well, I guess I should say the past 2 weeks, hasn't seen a whole lot of movement, especially in the north and northeast of the country. The Russian effort has kind of mostly stalled out. There was some Russian advances 2 weeks ago in the northeast when they were pushing trying to push to the east of Kiev in order to help encircle the city, but they got hung up on a town east of Kiev called Brovary, and the Ukrainians seem to have stopped that advance there. And it seems the Russians have also been trying. I kind of mentioned this before, but it seems part of the reason that advance stalled out is because they had to redistribute forces to secure their supply line, which was very prolonged and remains prolonged and vulnerable. There was significant action 2 weeks ago. There was a push across the Dnieper River, which is the main largest river in Ukraine that kind of cuts the country in half. There's kind of two major crossing points across the river that the Russians have seized. One of them was Kokov something. I don't remember the full name, but that was one crossing. And then southwest of that was the city of Kherson, which they successfully seized. And so it seems that there was a pretty small effort to expand north from Kokaz, but more troops were sent, it seems, across the crossing at Kherson. And that axis of advance was very much focused on a city called Mykolaiv. And it was there that they met significant resistance, and the city held out. But then they tried to bypass it and move northwest. And it wasn't clear if they were trying to encircle Odessa or if they were trying to move to some other objective. It's not clear. But what happened is that northwestern advance was halted and defeated outright at a city called something like Slavychensk. The Wall Street Journal did a whole piece on the battle, and apparently the Russians were just caught off guard, and the advance force was just obliterated. So at that point, the advance halted, and then there was a counteroffensive around Mykolaiv. And that Ukrainian counteroffensive, which I believe was more in the past week, that successfully cut off the advance northwest of Mykolaiv. And they were even successful in pushing the Russians away from Mykolaiv. So at this point, they basically won the Battle of Mykolaiv, and it pushed the Russians back to Kherson. And there was significant fighting west of Kherson between Ukrainians and Russians, so it seems that there was at least an effort on the part of the Ukrainians to try to retake the city. It does not seem to have been successful thus far, but they've done a lot of damage to the Russians rather in the south of Ukraine. And they've also done a lot of damage to Russian forces that were in the city of Kherson itself. There were a number of air raids, if not also drone strikes and missile strikes, targeting the airport at Kherson, where a number of Russian air assets were located. And a multitude of Russian helicopters were destroyed in that manner. The joke online was that the Russians just keep trucking them into Kherson to be destroyed because they don't seem to be using them for much else. They also targeted the headquarters of Russian forces in southern Ukraine, which had been set up in Kherson, and successfully destroyed that outpost. I don't know if they were able to kill any high-ranking officials, but it seems they did kill some staff members, and that'll probably also significantly hinder Russian efforts to defend the city. Always very effective to try to target the opponent's command and control mechanisms. That just makes it very difficult to organize defense. So the Ukrainians will probably get some advantage out of that, although I don't know if it'll be enough for them to retake the city. So basically pretty significant Ukrainian gains in the south, or at least in the southwest anyway, and continued strong defense in the north. As for the Russians in the past week in particular, most of their momentum seems to be in the east of the country in Donbass. That had been a pretty quiet front in the first couple weeks, but in the past weeks, it's definitely the main axis of advance for Russia. And, they're kind of caught up in the Battle of Izium, at least that one prong is, but they've been making progress in other areas. And it seems like what they're trying to do is to meet up with forces in the south of Ukraine in order to completely cut off Ukrainian army forces in the Donbass from the rest of Ukraine. They've made some progress on that count, but it's been slow, and the Ukrainians are fighting pretty hard to try to avoid that fate. It'll be interesting to see whether or not they just try to hold out as long as they can, or if they withdraw forces from the Donbass in order to reallocate them into a safer area that isn't in danger of being encircled. But that's something to kind of watch for. Let's see. I've just got some random notes here, but I'll just kind of try to push through them here. So there was a clarification I wanted to make, and this is something I saw on Twitter from some of the analysts I'd been reading. So I'd said earlier that it was 75% of uh, Russian, the Russian military, I think is what I said, that had been deployed as part of the invasion force outside Ukraine. That's not quite accurate. What it was is 75% of total Russian battalion tactical groups had been deployed into Ukraine as part of the invasion. So not quite the same thing, but I just wanted to make the clarification there. Let's see. As for the invasion force that had been built up outside Ukraine before the war, 100% of that has been committed now. They had been sort of committing forces slowly over time. But as of this past week, that entire force has now been committed. And it seems that's part of the reason that they're having the manpower shortage and are trying to find new sources, new soldiers, basically, to send in to fight.
Do we know roughly what percentage that is of the total Russian military?
So the number that I read is that the total Russian military is about 900,000 regulars and then about 2 million some in reserve. So the invasion force was, I want to say, I've seen different numbers, but I'm going to go with 190,000. So roughly, let's say, a third of the Russian military.
Mm-hmm.
And mind you, the invasion force was very much, what's the word I want? Well, the tooth to tail ratio was very much in favor of tooth. As has been made obvious at this point, the Russians did not really dedicate nearly enough logistical forces to sort of propagate the invasion. So it seems most of that 190,000 is combat units. So on the Ukrainian side, they've got about, I want to say, 300,000 in their military as a whole. And so a good chunk of that is going to be logistics, obviously. So maybe around like, I don't know, I want to say like 60,000 combat troops. So this is why, everybody was saying that the Ukrainians were outnumbered and that, their chances weren't very good. It was basically 190,000 Russian combat troops versus like around 60,000. So that's pretty lopsided in the grand scheme of things. But the Ukrainians were lucky in that the Russians just didn't supply their people. So a lot of their best units ended up getting wasted. And now they're having to kind of find whoever they can, just to try to fill in the gaps. But yeah, it's kind of balanced in Russia's favor, but they've sort of wasted the quantitative advantage with poor planning and poor leadership and poor logistics.
Yeah, the wild card that they may not have expected, if you're working through all the diligence of what could go wrong, is getting very top of the line support in military tech from other countries as soon as they engage. So like having a shitload of javelins, is that something that they expected Ukraine to have when for the US we decided that we're not going to do boots on the ground, but we can send them a shitload of javelins, which is a really, really cost effective defense. You get a gun that kills tanks and there are people in the tanks as well, and it can be operated by someone with very little training. That changes the problem a lot from if Ukraine had 0 javelins, then the tanks would have been that much more successful pushing in. And it wasn't something that Ukraine had in this number before. Same thing with like the Turkish drones. Maybe they expected to have a lot more air dominance than they did, and then Turkey sends a shitload of drones, and then now they're getting harassed from the air all the time, which if you're looking at the Russian logistics and you say, well, if they didn't expect either of those two things, then maybe it wouldn't have looked like as much of a failure. But that was based on the circumstances changing as soon as the war started. You could theory craft that, but it does take, I think, a cynical attitude. And the word on the street is Putin wanted to hear everyone agreeing with him, and that was what he wanted. He wants to take that fight, and he wants everyone to agree, yes, this is a good idea, let's go ahead with this, as opposed to the doubters who would say, what if they get a shitload of javelins? Is it actually good to send these rusted bucket tanks that needed more maintenance and maybe require a lot more mechanical attention than we realize? They may have either waited longer or waited to commit more. Yeah, this is something that didn't happen with, think about the Iraq war. Like when the US is invading Iraq, it wasn't like there was another country that is like, okay, we need to give a shitload of extremely cutting-edge tech weapons to Hussein's regime, and then they're going to fight against the U.S. with modern tech. They're basically punching down in the Iraq War, where it's a top-of-the-line modern military that has all the best shit against one that is weaker and more dated. In this case, Ukraine is getting a bunch of top-of-the-line, best tech available, and they're against some corrupt military that hasn't been taking their tanks into the shop as often as they should have.
Yeah, the Russians would have been better prepared for sure if they had assumed that there would be resistance, but they didn't. So they ended up just running face first into a brick wall.
Mm-hmm.
But I would point out that the Ukrainian military is definitely not cutting edge. You know, for as much as they tried to modernize the force after 2014 and professionalize it, they don't have like the most modern equipment, and even the stuff that we've sent is not like top-notch stuff.
Right, we give
hand-me-downs.
We give hand-me-downs.
Yeah. There's a concern that if we send like the best stuff, then it's just going to get captured. You know, in which case they can reverse engineer it and whatnot. So there's kind of an aversion to doing that. So a lot of the equipment is kind of older gen stuff. It still works very effectively because, you know, the stuff the Russians are using is even older. So they still end up with the advantage. But yeah, the Ukrainian military is not like it's not quite on par with like Western militaries. You know, they've still got room for improvement there. I would say that probably the biggest investment that they made, and the one that's paying dividends right now, was investment in personnel and leadership. You know, one of the things I read is that but some of the units in the Ukrainian army were NATO certified, which surprised me. But, you know, that's not just a matter of equipment, that's a matter of training and leadership. So we're seeing, to a degree, in Ukraine right now, some of the tactics and strategies that would have been used in Western Europe in the event of a Soviet invasion during the Cold War. You know, these are the kinds of things that they were kind of learning from Western advisors. And seems to be working. Seems to be pretty effective. And again, that's a credit to the professionalization effort. You know, that's not something that you can just do on the fly or learn quickly. That's something you've got to train for over time. So full credit to the officers in the Ukrainian army. You know, they seem to have really internalized the lessons and are using them to great effect. And I would also point out as a side note that the Bayraktar drones do not quite have free reign over Russian forces. You know, they can be shot down when Russian air defenses are present. You know, it's surprising, honestly, they haven't shot down more, but the Ukrainians have been pretty good about trying to destroy air defense systems where they can. And when they do, that creates an opening, you know, for drone operations. You know, so the air over Ukraine is still very much contested.
Did you see the video of that song they made for Bayraktar?
Oh, the music video? Yeah.
Yes.
That's great. That's pretty great. Very catchy. Pretty great lyrics, too.
Bayraktar. There is some discussion in the chat. Some people are getting very angry about it. There's a kind of talking point for Russian propaganda, which could have truth to it. This is another thing where we talk about our bias. Every news source has a bias that includes people talking in world discussion with Agent Smith, turns out. And whenever you're reading stuff, you want to factor that in when you're trying to figure out what's actually going down. And some of the reasoning for getting involved in this conflict was oppression of Russian people in Ukraine and eastern Ukraine, which, as we know as people in the world, if there's a majority group and minority groups, it's pretty common that the minority groups will have barriers against them, and it's more difficult for them to do stuff than the majority group. So in that sense, maybe there was something going on. Was there anything that you heard about with regards to this? Because the way that Russia pitches it is like it was a very systematic thing and they needed to just go to war straight away.
Oh no, that's not accurate. No, there has been violence by ultranationalist Ukrainian groups over the past 10 years. So that's not false. Those groups do exist. And the Ukrainian government was not well positioned to deal with them after 2014, just because of all the chaos and unrest, and just because of inherent lack of administrative capacity on the part of the Ukrainian state. Everybody's favorite example is the Azov Battalion, which was explicitly an all-volunteer group comprised entirely of neo-Nazis, some of which weren't even from Ukraine. There was actually neo-Nazis from outside Ukraine that came and volunteered. And I don't know if they ever went after Russian civilians in Ukraine specifically, although there were some allegations when they went and fought in Donbass. But I do know that they tried to scupper the Minsk II Accords while they were stationed in eastern Ukraine. There was part of the Minsk Accords was that the Ukrainian military had to withdraw beyond, I want to say, 100 miles from the ceasefire line with the separatists. And the Azov Battalion basically just refused to do so, which obviously is a problem as far as implementation of the Minsk Accords. But I want to say like around 2019, 2020, Zelensky, after he became president, went and managed to force them to leave, basically. And also, I've also read that the unit was sort of dispersed. It still exists. There is still an Azov battalion, but I don't think it's like still an all-volunteer force. I think it's just a regular force of the Ukrainian military at this point. So the volunteers have basically gone and been replaced by regulars, in other words, as I understand it.
I was reading a little bit about the Wagner group, and it almost sounds like they're kind of the equivalent on either side, where the Wagner group does have some, like the guy who founded it is a neo-Nazi, and they have a lot of that symbolism and stuff, and it's a more radicalized branch that was integrated into Russian military, but there's definitely an ideological slant that has some Nazi flavor to it. So the Azov battalion is kind of like the other side of that. And I was talking about this before we started with Agent Smith of the whole denazify argument, and how there are people who are into the fascist ideology stuff in basically every country. We have people like that who show up at rallies and events and stuff in the US. So it's not as though any country is free of that. The question is, was it so grotesque and extreme that they needed to go into full-scale war? The West has basically said, no, that's bullshit. Maybe there was oppression, yes. Was there oppression to the extent that you need to overthrow a sovereign state? No.
Yeah, I don't think there's evidence for broad-based oppression, specifically on the part of the Ukrainian state. Certainly, there have been language laws, for example, passed that enshrine the Ukrainian language as the official language. And I remember last year there was a law passed that was like a native language law that was meant to protect native languages, and Russian was not one of them. So a lot of Russian nationalists were upset about that. But beyond that, there's never been an effort to like systematically marginalize Russians that I'm aware of. And I would point out, just as a kind of postscript here, that nothing the Ukrainian government has done since 2014 has been nearly as oppressive as anything the separatist republics have been doing in their own territory. Because again, those are explicitly authoritarian statelets. There's no freedom of speech, freedom of the press, etc. Like those are explicitly authoritarian. So Ukraine has not oppressed ethnic Russians within its own territory nearly as much as those Russian-backed republics have, even given the far-right violence that has occurred. And I would add that the far-right violence has been in decline. They don't even have seats in the legislature anymore. They pretty much lost most, if not all of them, in recent years. I mean, they even lost them immediately after Euromaidan, which was ostensibly a neo-Nazi movement, according to Russian propaganda. So, it's just, the argument has lots of holes in it. It doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. They basically take a problem that exists and try to turn it into something that it's not.
Yeah, that makes it more believable, though, than if it was a purely fictitious thing.
Yeah.
You have to make it believable, at least. And that's what, in this Putin's War documentary was really focusing on was understanding public perception and how to steer people's idea and also how to control the media and thus how they think. And that's one of the main differences between, say, US news and Russian news is we don't really have state-sponsored media, at least not directly state-sponsored. You have private corporations where you have names like Rupert Murdoch and stuff who own a bunch of different news outlets, and they have a lot of control over what information people get. Whereas in Russia, it's pretty much all state-sponsored at this point. Anyone who was a critic of Putin, made fun of Putin, whatever, they're either silenced or in jail or both.
Yeah, oppression in Russia has definitely been escalating since 2014. Slowly at first, and then now rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty much explicitly an authoritarian country and no longer even an illiberal democracy. You know, even illiberal democracies allow some dissent. The Russian government now seems beyond even that.
Mm-hmm.
Which is part of the reason so many people have been leaving. But yeah, it's not really a fair criticism to say Ukraine is a Nazi government. It's explicitly not.
Mm-hmm.
And it's overselling the point to say that they have a massive endemic neo-Nazi problem. You know, there's not really substantive evidence of that either.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, authoritarianism versus libertarianism, how much space and leeway you give people to do stuff. It's been a wake-up call for me in realizing the amount of free speech that we have in the US. Yes, the way that we talk is enforced and or policed more than I think it has been in the past, especially with stuff like community justice of canceling people on social media platforms and that kind of a thing. But in the US, you are free to say that your president sucks, like in public, and you won't be arrested for that. And in Russia, you will. So that's another point of compassion that I have for the Russian people is many of them, if they were maybe the same age as us, they grew up in Russia and they're adults now and they don't have the option to have free speech and they can't really push for it in the same public capacity that we can organize amongst each other. Maybe you have some social issue that you think is really important or maybe some policy that you want changed. You can go make a Facebook group. You can go find an IRL group, put up like bulletin board shit all over, and you can say what you believe in. And that's something that I think most of us take for granted on a daily basis is you're free to criticize the president in your country, in many countries. And that's something that you should be allowed to do. Because if you don't get the opportunity to, then they're going to make a bunch of bad decisions and all you can do is just sit there and be quiet. Or protest and then get fined and thrown in jail, which is also not super fun.
Yeah, liberal democracy has its flaws, but it's a valuable institutional mechanism by which to avoid some of the worst excesses of government. We don't always appreciate that, but certainly we're learning now, as you say. Or relearning it, as the case may be. Let's see some other points here. The mayor of Melitopol, which is a city in southeastern Ukraine, was detained by the Russians for not cooperating with their occupation regime. He was released in exchange for 9 Russian POWs. I had read about this last week, and I had thought it was like a special forces raid by the Ukrainians, but it turned out it was just a prisoner exchange. So he's free now, and I'm not sure. He's obviously not going to be able to really do anything in Melitopol, but he is at least safe anyway. So that could be something we see more of. If more local governments refuse to cooperate with the Russians, there could be more exchanges like that. Let's see. I also read that the Ukrainian army has been shelling Russian forces in the city of Irpin, northwest of Kiev. So, just to be fair, that indicates that at least some of the damage to the city is due to Ukrainian fires and not just Russian fires. And let's see. Yeah. So there was a story out of Ukraine that I thought you might like. Uh, as always, it's difficult to verify, fog of war and all of that, but it's an interesting story at least. So in northeastern Ukraine in Chernihiv Oblast, there were some Russians who broke into the building belonging to the local hunting society, and they demanded a list of members. And the reason they did is that a lot of the hunters in Ukraine have basically gotten involved in guerrilla fighting, to one degree or another. Uh, and in the event of a successful Russian occupation, they would probably have to fight them anyway. So, better to have the list. So the chairman of the society, who was in the building, a guy named I'm going to take my best effort here, Anatoly Kulgaiko. So rather than give them the list, he allegedly detonated a grenade, killing himself and the Russian soldiers present.
Whoa.
So it sounds kind of propagandy to me. So I don't know if that's true for sure, but it makes for a good story anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly if it is true, that's an impressive act of self-sacrifice worthy of lauded. So that's also a kind of snapshot of the kind of things the Russians are going to be doing if they do end up occupying Ukraine, or at least part of it. They're going to try to find people they think are the most likely to resist and detain them. So getting lists of hunters is one way to do that. Getting lists of activists and politicians will be another. So they'll probably start going after them before too long, if they aren't already.
Yeah, even if that story isn't true, I think the concept highlights one of the really difficult things about being the aggressor is that the people who are defending their home have way, way more like moral motivation to sacrifice everything to stop you. Whereas the conscripts who are showing up, like they're not in it to lay down their life, vast majority of them. They're just there to get paid because it's their job to do military stuff.
Yeah, occupation is very difficult if you're up against a determined population. Historically, European powers were able to do it because they used extreme violence against the locals and basically forced them into submission. But in the case of Ukraine, they could do that, and they may still end up doing that. But for now, they're still trying to hang on to Ukraine without resorting to that, it seems. I haven't noted like extreme acts of retaliation yet. I think part of the reason is because they're still focused on fighting the Ukrainian army. So that's where most of their resources are. But maybe once that fighting ends, and if they're still occupying territory when it does, that's when you might see some of the worst atrocities be committed. Because at that point, they don't have the Ukrainian army to kind of distract them.
Mm.
Oh, and I also had a note here that this is something that was portrayed in Red Dawn, the 1980s movie. I think everybody's at least heard of it. It's a movie from the 1980s where the Soviet Union invades the United States. And one of the things that was shown in the movie was some Russian soldiers trying to get a list of gun owners in a given town.
That's gonna be a long list.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it was kind of realistic, but it was also some tongue-in-cheek commentary on the debate about gun registration, which has kind of been a bugbear on the part of pro-gun activists for a long time. Oh, I also had some interesting trivia here. It was the total Ukrainian military budget is about $4 billion, whereas the equivalent Russian military budget is about $50 billion. Ukrainians definitely getting their money's worth, it seems.
Mm.
Let's see, we kind of already talked about that. One of the things that I've seen in some reports from the Institute of War, which I highly recommend for anybody who wants to track the conflict from day to day, uh, one of the things they noted is that the Russians may not even have the capacity to concentrate. Well, I'll give you the quote: may not be able to concentrate the combat power necessary to resume major offensive operations towards Kiev within the week, despite several operational pauses to reconstitute forces, end quote. So that suggests severe logistical issues on the part of the Russians that they would not be able to do that. So that could, if they don't unwind their logistical situation, that could be a semi-permanent state of affairs. That it may be that they just can't mass enough forces in order to push through Ukrainian defenses, in which case we may already de facto have a stalemate on certain fronts.
Yeah, and in this case, a stalemate would mean that attacking into a position is so bad that you probably shouldn't, even though you might technically be able to win in the long term. Like, it's too costly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you may make ground, but it may be such a Pyrrhic victory that it ends up being a defeat in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
So I also have heard studies saying that something like a majority of Americans support a no-fly zone in Ukraine, a bipartisan support, no less. Uh, so I kind of wonder if people understand the full implications of that. I would assume not, since that would pretty much inevitably involve conflict with Russia, which has the potential, not a guarantee, but a potential to escalate into a nuclear exchange. But it was interesting, I thought, that people were sort of pro-intervention, at least to some degree.
Well, I think
And
a major difference that you sort of touched on before was with like the Syrian conflict and stuff, to your average American who doesn't browse world news and doesn't follow all the different regimes and stuff like that, a lot of these conflicts, they want to boil down into good guy, bad guy. And that's not really how the world works, but that's still how a lot of people think about movies and film and conflicts like this. You want to have a protagonist, someone who's good, and you have an antagonist, someone who's bad. And you usually view your own country as the protagonist, and then you stack up other countries based on whether they're on the same side or on the opposite side. And Russia, in both like film, stories, and then in the Cold War and so on, has been cast as the villain many, many times. And then Ukraine is fighting in Western Ukraine to defend a lot of their democratic leanings and institutions and that kind of a thing, doing it more in our style rather than in their style. So for them to feel like, hey, we should go back them up because they're trying to have the same freedoms that we're trying to have over here, I think it fits pretty neatly into that clear good guy, bad guy scenario. Obviously, the Russian people didn't all collectively vote for this conflict, so it's not saying the Russian people are bad. It's saying that this move by Putin puts the Russian military very cleanly in the bad guy category. So for them to just say, like, we should take more aggressive action there, that's why I would guess that they're saying yes to the no-fly zone.
yeah, that's probably correct. I wouldn't dispute it. But the reason I brought it up is because RAND, the think tank, released a little, I don't even want to call it a report, but basically just a fact sheet, if you like. Well, let's call it a press release. Basically, they were trying to make an argument in favor of a no-fly zone, not because they want a no-fly zone per se, but just for the sake of argument, they were trying to kind of highlight some of the pros and cons. And I still think a no-fly zone is off the table. I don't think anybody really wants to go that far in risking a nuclear conflict, but there are at least some reasons why it might be a good idea. So two of the reasons that I had here. One, ruling out a no-fly zone here incentivizes nuclear proliferation, just in the sense that it shows that if you have nuclear weapons, you can get away with a lot of, well, bad behavior, so to speak, much more so than you can without. So there is a kind of moral hazard here being established. I don't think really that's a moral hazard that didn't already exist, so I don't know that it really matters that much, in my opinion, but technically this is reinforcing that issue. And then another reason in favor, another argument in favor of a no-fly zone is that Putin may end up escalating even without the no-fly zone. Because, the United States and Western Europe, well, Europe as a whole at this point, pretty much, are really crossing a lot of lines, so to speak. We've been very gung-ho about supplying weapons and whatnot to Ukraine, weapons which are being used to kill Russian soldiers. So that's kind of belligerent, one could argue. So it might be that the Russian government eventually responds to that, especially if we start giving, better and more complex weapon systems to the Ukrainians. It may be that they end up escalating things with the West, even without the no-fly zone, such that we may not end up in any different a place with the no-fly zone than we would have ended up without it. So in that sense, maybe it just makes sense to go and do it. I'm not saying those are the best arguments, but those were some that Rand put out, so that's something worth thinking about. Oh yeah, I wanted to. So this is kind of a subplot. It doesn't really have to do with the war itself per se, but it does tie in. So there are reports now that a couple thousand of Mariupol's civilian population were taken by the Russian military and moved into Russia. And we don't really know what happened to them. So that's kind of an interesting open question. There had been talk about humanitarian corridors out of Mariupol on the condition that they would go to Russia. That was sort of the Russian government's big troll from 2 weeks ago. I guess I didn't mention that. We didn't get a chance to talk about that. There's been a lot of talks. There had been a lot of talk about humanitarian corridors to allow the civilian population out of Mariupol so that they can leave the city. But the Russians have kind of reneged on some of their promises to honor the ones that they've agreed to. I think there was some, like in the past day or two, that they agreed to, and that were not actually fired upon. But one of the things they did last week is that they agreed to a humanitarian corridor, or at least another one out of Mariupol. But the caveat was that the people leaving would have to go to Russia and take shelter there. And the Ukrainian army, well, the Ukrainian government was not amused by that. That just seemed like such a troll move on the part of the Russian government to do that. So this could be something like that. They could be trying to get Ukrainian civilians into Russia so that they can provide them shelter and humanitarian aid and try to show that they're not the bad guys, so to speak. A kind of PR victory there for them. They haven't done that yet. At least I haven't seen any footage to that effect. And, I kind of have to wonder how the Ukrainian civilians involved really feel about it. But, yeah, just what exactly they're doing with them and how they're doing is not entirely clear as of now. So that's something to keep an eye on. Well, let's see.
Have you heard anything about opposition within Russia to the war? Because there's obviously going to be people who are opposed to it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's been protests. But actually, I learned a new word the past week. It's kind of a useful word. It's called vatnik. And a vatnik is somebody in Russia. This is a slang term from Russia. It's a slang term referring to people who are just blind followers of the Russian state-owned media. Basically just raw nationalists who don't question the state.
Mm-hmm.
And the plural form of the word, I believe, is vatniki. And I might add here that vatniki, such as it's defined in Russia, are not a phenomena unique to Russia. You can find people like that in any country. So maybe this is a word we could adopt in the West, because I can certainly think of people who it might apply to.
Mm-hmm.
But in Russia, the vatniki, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, the vatniki are still supporting Putin, and they comprise a big chunk of the Russian body politic. So their support, if nothing else, will probably keep the government going. There's a lot of people who are more liberal-minded who live in the cities and, go to college, students, people like that, who are dead set against the government and dead set against the war. So that hasn't changed. And some of them have become more vocal. And I'll talk, I've got some examples of that here. in my notes, but basically most people I think are just kind of sitting it out. Most people are either impartial or think that maybe the West brought it on itself or something like that. But basically, they're just not really interested to the point where they want to get involved. That could change if economic conditions deteriorate, but I don't think they're going to get so bad that the neutral party will be mobilized. At least that's the outlook right now. We'll see how things pan out. But for now, the weight in Russian politics is very much in favor of pro-government
Hmm.
people. So I wouldn't have high expectations as far as any kind of challenge to the legitimacy of the state to the point where the state might have to step down in the war or anything like that. I think maybe there's two things I can think of that might change that situation. One, economic decline to the point where there's just a very clear and seemingly irreversible decline in quality of life. That's one thing. And it would have to be pretty severe. But if it were severe and at the same time the Russian government started sending conscripts back in rather, in order to fill gaps in manpower, and they started suffering substantive casualties, those two factors combined, I think, would be enough to cause significant unrest. Because even if people aren't really that invested in the conflict itself or in challenging the Russian government, there's a lot of families that have sons that have to do the mandatory military service who would be very upset, if their kids were put in danger, or or even if they'd had to die in the conflict.
Hmm.
And that plus significant economic hardship uh, would probably mobilize people much greater than any other thing. Because Russians have done economic hardship before. They did that in the 90s, so that's bearable. But if they're having to bear it as a result of a war that they didn't ask for, that involves the deaths of their children, the conscripts, that's maybe a bridge too far for them.
Mm.
I can't say for sure, but that's definitely proven to be a catalyst in previous generations in Russian history as far as pushing people to revolt. So, in summary, Russians are willing to suffer for their state, but they're not willing to suffer for a shit cause.
Mm.
It's got to be something that at least has some legitimacy to it. Let's see. I guess we kind of already talked about the aid. It's pretty considerable. One of the interesting things that the United States is looking at sending, and I think they've already sent them the first batch, is a new drone called the Switchblade drone. I guess maybe it's not new, but it's new to me. This is the first I'd heard of it. And well, have you heard of this, Neuro, at all?
No.
So basically, it's like a backpack drone. It's small enough to fit in a backpack. You can carry it around. It's meant for use by infantry,
Hmm.
and it's more of a tactical weapon, from what I was reading about it. You can kind of send it in the air, and it can perform as a loitering munition, which is to say that you can just throw it in the air and it'll fly in a given area, and it'll try to seek out targets that meet a certain target profile that you program into it, and will attack them. And it's not meant to, it doesn't fly back to you. It's just what you might call a suicide drone. When it finds a target, it dives on it and explodes.
Mm.
And the warhead has about the power of a grenade, from what I was reading. So it's mostly meant for anti-personnel targets. It's mostly meant to go after enemy infantry, but also maybe lightly armored vehicles as well. And the idea there is just to try to get the jump on enemy infantry in a given area, or maybe to go after targets that are relatively close by. It has a range of something like, I want to say 20 miles, 10 miles, something like that. I guess I could check my notes. 10 kilometers. It can be controlled up to at a distance of up to 10 kilometers, and it has a flight time of about 10 minutes. So it's not long range, but uh, if you're at the front line, you might be able to use it to go after artillery, for example, that are in the enemy rear. And that was the thing that kind of caught my eye. One of the big advantages the Russian military has over the Ukrainians is indirect fire weaponry. So ground rocket systems, artillery, etc. So if there could be some kind of weapon we could give them that would be able to penetrate Russian air defenses and reliably destroy targets in the Russian rear, that could be a good way to go after Russian artillery and negate their sort of major advantage in the war thus far. And if the Switchblade could do that, that would significantly even the odds in the conflict between the Russian army and the Ukrainian army. So I don't know if that's what they'll use them for, and I don't know if they'll even send them enough to do that. But that's something to watch, basically. If nothing else, it'll give the infantry a big advantage because when you throw the weapon up in the air, you can go a pretty good distance. You can. It actually has a camera on it that you can use, and you can. It's got a display unit that you can see through. That you can observe what the camera sees. So that allows a lot of flexibility. It's not just a loitering munition, in other words. It's not just totally automated. You can also fly it manually and attack targets manually. And it's even got a mechanism in it that allows you to paint a target, which is not it's not an infrared system. It's not a night vision system. It's purely motion detection. You can paint a target like a person, for example, and it'll lock onto them and track them wherever they move and then home in on them for the kill. So it's got different types of terminal guidance systems that give it a great deal of flexibility. So that'll be a big advantage on the infantry level, at least,
Yeah,
if
and
nothing else.
I've seen some videos too of tanks getting shot down unescorted, and a lot of people were like, "Oh man, that's such a bad practice. You need people with guns next to the tanks." Kind of like how in StarCraft, if someone's going Marine tank, that's way stronger than just sending tanks only, because if you get cheap units or things that can jump on the tanks where they don't thrive, then the tanks are basically just a really expensive waste of time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been an issue for Russia, either not providing the support because they don't have the people or because the people don't want to follow around the tanks. It is dangerous too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was more a problem in the first week. There seemed to be an observable aversion on the part of the Russian soldiers to dismount vehicles and provide infantry support. I've seen a lot more Russian infantry action in the past 2 weeks, so that seems to be something that they've at least addressed, if not outright fixed. But you can still find Russian vehicles that are isolated. The convoys that get raided, for example, are a case in point.
Mm-hmm.
And then when there's urban fighting, that's also I've also seen examples there where vehicles have been isolated. Although you need infantry support there more than anywhere. But it seems that urban combat is another thing that Russian infantry are averse to thus far.
I've also heard that urban combat is really difficult too.
Yeah.
Because you've got tall buildings where there could be any number of people holed out inside of it ready to shoot at you at any point. It's a lot more dicey than just traveling through a field where people could only be in a hole in the ground and that's about it.
Yeah, exactly. Mariupol right now is experiencing that. There's been heavy fighting in the city center over the past few days. So I don't begrudge the Russians that are responsible for seizing the city. It seems that resistance is going to be pretty stiff.
Yeah, and it does seem like, too, if you're the aggressor pushing into another country, it's really difficult to know the difference between, okay, there's military that's hiding in this building, so we're going to shoot at them, as opposed to there are civilians in that building and they're just living there, and shooting them is a war crime. You're gonna have casualties even if you're trying to do war well. Obviously, the Ukrainian propaganda is going to be highlighting every misstep that they make and saying, "See, aren't they the bad guys here?" But I think, generally speaking, as the aggressor, you are needing to sign up as the bad guy in a lot of capacities by default, just because it's going to be virtually impossible to only shoot military targets all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely hard as an aggressor to do that, to target enemy units without collateral damage, given that they are defending cities and whatnot. But certainly the onus is on them, given that it was their war of choice.
True.
So the responsibility definitely still falls sort of at their feet. And when you have a war like this, you have a choice of how much firepower you bring to bear.
Hmm.
And contrary to what I've sometimes read from some of the proponents of the war, I don't think the Russian military is holding a whole lot back overall. They seem to be bringing the heat as far as laying siege to cities and whatnot. So that's a choice on their part. They didn't have to do that. To be fair, it's kind of in the Russian, well, not kind of, it is the Russian doctrine uh, to use artillery heavily. I should say in the Russian army. It's the Russian army's doctrine to eliminate opponents and resistance using artillery. I don't think civilians are really what they had in mind when they wrote the doctrine. I think really it's just conventional warfare. That's how they approach conventional warfare. In the West, we tend to take a somewhat different approach. Artillery is kind of more of a supporting mechanism. You're supposed to defeat the enemy sort of on the field, with artillery used to soften them up or to create opportunities. But the Russian approach is more to use conventional forces to find the enemy and then to obliterate them with artillery and then to push through the gaps.
Mm.
So it was already an artillery-centric army. That was already sort of their model for fighting wars. So it's not necessarily that surprising that they're using a lot of artillery here, given that the cities are basically just fortified centers of resistance. But even so, given that they know that there's a lot of civilians there, they had the choice of not doing that, and they chose not to.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you could blame the Ukrainians for fighting in the cities.
That's where they live, dude.
Well, yeah, that then is the obvious counter argument. Like, of course they're going to fight to protect the cities. That just makes sense. It's intuitive, but there's when it comes to people who when it comes to nationalists, there's almost nothing they won't say
Yeah.
to defend their country's choices, whether they're good or bad choices. So that's some of the argumentation I've seen online.
Why are you fighting in this city? It's my house, bro. Oh.
Let's see. I'm going to send you a thing here in Discord, and it's just a link to a short list of all the stuff that the latest aid package the United States is sending to Ukraine has in it. Just for the benefit of listeners, I can kind of just briefly go through it. It's 800 Stinger anti-aircraft systems, 2,000 javelins, 1,000 light anti-armor weapons, 6,000 AT-4 anti-armor systems, 100 tactical unmanned aerial system, that's UAVs, 100 grenade launchers, 5,000 rifles, 1,000 pistols, 400 machine guns, 400 shotguns, over 20 million rounds of small arms ammunition and grenade launcher and mortar rounds, 25,000 sets of body armor, and 25,000 helmets.
And a partridge in a pear tree. That is a lot of stuff.
It's a considerable amount of stuff, and that's just the beginning. They've already set aside money to send even more in the future. One of the notes that I took is that there's $6.5 billion in the DoD that's been set aside for Ukraine. Some of that is operations mission support. Some of it involves the deployment of personnel. Some of it involves intelligence support, of which we've been providing a lot. And then about half of it, around $3.5 billion, is just replenishment of U.S. stocks, a good chunk of which have been expended in order to send them to Ukraine, in order to help the government. Let's see. One of the things that the Ukrainian military has been asking for is a modern surface-to-air missile system so that they can bolster their air defenses. Their ability to contest the air has been one of their big advantages thus far. So if that can be supported in some way, that would definitely go a long way towards solidifying control of the air. The Ukrainian government has been painting it as a matter of protecting cities from bombardment, but most of the advantage would go towards the Ukrainian army if they were able to secure the air, which is the main reason they're asking for it. And they may actually get it. Slovakia said that they were going to transfer their S-300 SAM batteries to Ukraine. And from what I read, they're going to be compensated for those with Patriot batteries from the Netherlands and Germany. So it says in my notes. So we're not sending them like the most modern Western stuff, the Patriot missile systems, but it seems there is a great willingness to send them older Soviet stuff, which makes sense because, Ukraine already has a lot of Soviet equipment, pretty much all Soviet equipment almost. So that's what they're already used to using. They've already got people who are trained to use that equipment and would be able to put it to good effect. If you sent more modern stuff, it would be a problem because it would take probably weeks, if not months, to train them on it, by which time the conflict may have been decided. So if they send the Soviet stuff, they can get that in action much quicker, basically. Let's see. I already talked about the Switchblade. So one of the things that I read in the past week is that the Biden administration has been pretty consistently averse to sending more equipment, and that they were pretty averse from the start to getting involved, and that most of the U.S. position on Ukraine has been more a response to European involvement. So it would be kind of awkward for the United States to not send something that the Europeans themselves were sending. So the United States has basically matched European commitments to Ukraine. So that would make sense to me. You know, the Biden administration has been pretty averse to foreign adventures since they came into office, and I think one of Biden's personal missions, so to speak, has been to try to cater and pander to the anti-war sentiment in the U.S. population, of which there is obviously a considerable amount after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So trying to avoid interventions seems to be one of the guiding stars of the Biden administration. And it seems that was also one of their guiding stars on Ukraine. But having the European states jump in and provide all manner of support, the United States seems to be matching the commitment where it happens. So I guess that's another example of what you might call leading from behind, as it was called in the Obama administration. We're not going to get more involved in the conflict than the Europeans themselves are willing to get involved. I imagine that would be a relatively popular position amongst the American population. I know there's polls out that say that most people in the United States are critical of the Biden administration for not doing more. But at the same time, I think if the Biden administration had just jumped in and maybe even considered intervening, there would have been a lot of pushback. So I don't blame the Biden administration for being wary. American political sentiment can swing pretty wildly, and very quickly. So aversion to interventionism, given the recent history in the United States, I think was probably the wiser course. I think there's room to do more. I think they could be a little more risk tolerant. But I don't know if the U.S. public would tolerate it in the long term. Let's see. Oh, the Ukrainians have also been asking for armed drones. We're sending some in the form of the Switchblade, but I think maybe they have more advanced stuff in mind, stuff like the Bayraktar, if not maybe Reaper drones. I don't think they're going to get Reapers, but we may help them procure more Bayraktars. They were also asking for anti-ship missiles. I don't think we'll send them, but we could. I think we've got some older stuff in the inventories that we might be okay with parting with. So it would certainly be an escalation to give them anti-ship missiles, because there's been a Russian flotilla of ships outside of Odessa that's kind of been threatening to land forces there and maybe push on the city and link up with Russian forces elsewhere. I don't think they're going to land because there's just so much intelligence that has, there's just so much reconnaissance by the West that has their eyes on them that they, if they did move, we would know right away and we would tell the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians have had time to kind of prepare their beaches for defenses to defend against an invasion like that. And another reason is that Russian forces around Mykolaiv have been basically defeated. So the forces that a landing force would have linked up with are now gone. So if they did land, it would be probably an isolated landing that wouldn't really have anywhere to go right away. So all told, it would probably be a shit show, especially given some of the performance of Russian forces in other parts of Ukraine. So I don't think they'll actually land, but they are at least threatening to do so. And that's tying down some Ukrainian forces who have to try to be there just in case. So anti-ship missiles could be used by the Ukrainians to try to, sink some ships in that flotilla, and that would be a pretty significant escalation. But I don't know if it would be enough of an escalation towards a substantial Russian response. So that's something to keep an eye on. I think the West might be in the mood to kind of escalate a little bit, just in that regard, just to show that, just to try to signal to Russia that the U.S. and the West is committed to defending Ukraine. But you never know. Russia may wig out and, escalate significantly in some other area. It's not clear. Let's see, air defense systems already talked about. Off the ship. So something else they're asking for is off-the-shelf secure communications equipment. Uh, I think we would be willing to give that to them. Certainly, the Russians are showing right now why using unsecure communication systems is an unwise choice. There's been more Russian generals and officers who have been murdered on that count, murdered or assassinated, whatever your preferred term. It came out that that was geolocation. It turns out that the generals that they've been assassinating were using their cell phones, well, smartphones, whatever they're called. And the Ukrainian intelligence agency was able to geolocate them and then fire missiles at their location.
Just from using their cell phone GPS data?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Well, the Russians don't have any secure proprietary communication systems of their own that they can use. They did develop one, but it apparently requires 3G, and so they've been pretty much locked out of that. So it doesn't really work. So they've been using a combination of their own personal phones and then also written orders, which is something else I've read about recently. In some cases, they just haven't been able to even use their radios, even the unsecure ones, to get commands through to frontline units. And so they'll actually write out the orders and they'll send messengers to go physically to the front line to give the orders to the officers there. And of course, because the supply lines are not secure, some of those guys have actually been captured. So the Ukrainians actually have some of those handwritten orders, and they've been posting some of them on social media.
Yeah, that's the thing is like, do you tech up or tech down for secrecy? Because if you're using the tech of the day, well, they can just see your phone and everything that it's doing. You could use a crusty old ass phone. Maybe that could be a thing. But that's limited in certain ways. It can't do as much as a modern phone. And then you've got the old school pen and paper approach. Just get a piece of paper and write it. They would never
suspect it. It worked for a long
it.
time.
Yeah.
It is feasible, but it just kind of shows the degree to which Russia's command and control capability in Ukraine is just not really up to snuff. You know, they really should have had their own system available, you know, for the purpose. As is, they don't. So they're suffering for it. But the Ukrainians may also have similar problems that just haven't been publicized. I have to think they would have invested in it beforehand, but the fact that they're asking for them suggests maybe they didn't. So that's something to keep an eye on. Let's see. I think that was about it. Yeah. As far as aid, that was all I had to update on. So as far as diplomacy, some of the developments, the leaders of Poland, Czechia, and Slovenia traveled to Kiev. I don't know if you saw that in the news or not. I'll interpret that as a no.
No, sorry, someone's kind of rushing me.
No problem. Yeah, I guess they were presidents, but maybe they were prime ministers. I don't recall. But basically, the leaders of those respective countries actually themselves physically traveled to the capital of Ukraine, which was a pretty ballin' move considering all the fighting that's happening, just outside of the city. So I was pretty impressed with that show of solidarity there.
Oh, that was Macron and some other people?
No, Macron didn't go. It was I don't remember their name. One of them was Kaczynski. He's the prime minister of Poland.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not. I don't remember who the other two were. It was I guess the presidents of Czechia and Slovenia. But they were there, so full credit there. But a more important substantive move is that Ukraine was officially integrated into the European electric grid. So the rest of Europe is now sharing electricity with Ukraine, which will be pretty helpful given that some of their power stations have been taken by the Russians in the south. So that should at least help keep the lights on.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought this was a pretty bold move. We've talked about Moldova before, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the government of Moldova officially demanded that Russia withdraw from Transnistria, which was the separatist republic in the east of Moldova that the Russians have been stationing peacekeeping forces in. I don't think they can make them, but it was still a pretty bold move to just come out and make the demand.
Hmm.
So I thought that was a pretty interesting development. I don't think anything's going to come of it, but there could be. I don't think the Ukrainians have any forces to spare, but hypothetically they could move into Transnistria and eject Russian forces there on behalf of the Moldovan government. Highly unlikely, given that they're tied down elsewhere, and also highly unlikely because a lot of the Russians who live there would not like it. A lot of ethnic Russians in Transnistria who are very pro-Putin, so I don't think it would be really worth the effort. But yeah, that is in play at the moment to some degree. Oh, there's been more drama with the jets. This is kind of turning into a thing.
These are the jet deal between Poland, U.S., and Ukraine.
Yeah. So it was on sort of near the beginning of the war, and then it was off, and then it was on again,
Mm-hmm.
and then it was off again. So then it was on again, and then in the past 2 weeks, it's basically been scuppered. So it doesn't look likely to happen at this point, which surprised me because I would have figured the US would have done it if only just to signal to Russia that we were willing to do it. But the Biden administration seems averse to the idea, and I guess that fits into their overall risk-averse disposition on the conflict in general. But it still kind of surprised me. So the jet deal is off. There's different reasons why we can argue it basically isn't going to go forward, or why it was never going to go forward in the first place. Risk aversion on the part of the Biden administration is one such reason. But it could also be because the State Department and the Defense Department were not really communicating with each other over this. It seems like the State Department was much more gung-ho than the Defense Department. There's some precedent for this. Apparently, this was a problem during the withdrawal from Afghanistan as well. So there was obviously a pretty significant need for them to cooperate with each other in order to organize the withdrawal, but it just kind of didn't happen. So that's unfortunate. This would mark probably the third straight administration where the State Department and the Defense Department were not really on the same page. Now, you would hope that the Biden administration would be able to learn from the Trump and Obama administrations, but it seems not. It seems there's some kind of dysfunction there. So that's part of the reason. Another explanation I've heard is that the United States wanted to do it, but they wanted to do it secretly so as to avoid giving the Russians an excuse to escalate in some way. But Poland kind of spoiled it by, releasing a press statement saying that they were going to do the deal. So it may be that the U.S. was not willing to move forward in a overt way, as opposed to a covert way. And another explanation I've read is that President Zelensky prematurely announced the agreement in order to try to implicitly pressure the United States and the West into doing the deal. So basically, there was never any notion of doing the deal in the first place, and the Ukrainian government basically just announced it in the hopes of trying to make it come true. Another possibility here in this vein is that the Ukrainian government wanted to apply pressure on Western governments, not because they thought it was ever feasible to get the jets, but because they wanted to generate leverage to get the Western governments to give other stuff. So basically, there's public pressure in the West now because this deal fell through. People feel like we kind of stabbed them in the back in some cases. So now, as a result, there's some political pressure to kind of make up for it in some way. So as a result, Ukraine may end up getting stuff that they would not have gotten otherwise. So basically a PR maneuver, in other words.
Yeah, that's another question mark, I think, for your news follower, but someone who's not working for a government here is a lot of the information that's being passed around. Some of it should be like intentionally misleading to distract the other side. So there's like strategic news where it's not necessarily meant to be propaganda for common citizens. It's supposed to reflect your posture in such a way that you can use that information to your advantage. Like a feint, sort of.
Yeah, misdirection, misinformation, those are classical parts of warfare. Have been for forever. So yeah, there's definitely some kabuki theater happening as far as some of the information and media surrounding the war. I try to control for that, but it's hard to do because there's just so much of it. So I try to lean on, analysts on Twitter who are actually credentialed in institutions like the Institute of War in order to kind of get information that is at least based in experience and expertise.
Mm.
Let's see, what else did we have here? So just kind of a snapshot of Russian propaganda here. There's one woman named Margarita Simonyan, who's apparently well known in Russian state media as a propagandist, nationalist, however you want to frame that. And she kind of took a shot at all the people who are leaving Russia, specifically sort of the upper middle class, educated, hipster types. And she says that anyone ashamed of being Russian at this point is not really Russian, which is a pretty bold statement. So that kind of illustrates the sentiment amongst nationalists as far as some of the anti-war crowd in Russia. Let's see. Oh, also there was a theater in Mariupol that was either purposely or accidentally bombed, depending on who you talk to, but it was blown up by a Russian explosive. I think it was an airstrike. And it was particularly galling because the people taking shelter in the theater had actually spelled out the Russian word for children on the top of the theater in the hopes that that would be enough to try to make sure that nobody attacked it. So that didn't work. And as a result, there was a number of civilian casualties. I don't think it was as many as was first reported. I think most people managed to evacuate after the fact. But still, it was pretty grievous on the part of critics of Russia in the conflict. Another example of them being indiscriminate. So as far as this relates to Russian propaganda, the Russians have claimed, and I'll just read you the quote that I took from the article I was reading. The Russians claimed that an Azov defector informed them that the building was being used as a headquarters, leading to the strike. That was the initial claim. And then the next claim, now they claim that the Azov themselves blew up the building. So Russian propaganda has kind of gone back and forth on this. And the Azov battalion in particular features a lot, especially as far as the fighting in and around Mariupol. And this is just an anecdote. I thought this was kind of, representative, if not of Russia and the Russian, propaganda, but also perhaps propaganda in general. So there was a reporter who was talking to a woman in Russia, and he asked her how she got her information, or no, more specifically, how much do you trust the information you're getting on Russian TV about the war? And she said, quote, "I trust it. Why shouldn't I? It's the internet I don't trust."
Mm.
And he responded by asking her, "Why not?" And her response was, quote, "I don't know."
Hmm.
So that's indicative, I think, of a lot of people who are maybe not who are in Russia and who are not really paying much attention to the conflict and just leaning on state sources of information, and who are just not used to getting information from other sources. They don't use the internet much, and they just kind of instinctively don't trust it.
Those youngsters on that there internet, you can't trust a thing.
Meanwhile, cable news is complete garbage.
Now this is news.
Yeah, unfortunately, that seems to be a recurring pattern in many countries. Okay. Whoops. And now I broke it. Just a second while I fight with Excel.
You're fine. Okay, I think I've subdued it. Agent Smith versus Excel.
I don't use it as much anymore, or at least I don't use the more complex functions, so some of it I forget how to undo. Okay, so some miscellaneous notes here. There was a 68-year-old US citizen from Minnesota who was killed in Russian shelling in Chernihiv. nothing's going to come of it. The United States isn't going to like retaliate for that, but I just thought it was worth noting. U.S. citizens have and are involved in the conflict, not only in the sense that they're volunteering to fight, but also just some people are just living there, retired there or working there or what have you. And let's see. I guess I heard you mention before you already saw the Arnold Schwarzenegger video.
Yes.
Yeah, that was very well made. I don't
Yeah,
know if it'll have an impact, but
yeah, I think part of it is being able to point to the Russian people and say, hey, we still love you and you're still a part of this world. With the sanctions, I think for a lot of them can just make it feel like the world is cutting them off and doesn't want them anymore. When
mhm.
the sanctions are specifically a response to the government's actions sending in the military, and it's that they're taking issue with. And the sanctions, while it's tough to put that pressure on the Russian people, it's not that the world wants to put pressure on the Russian people themselves. It's they want Putin to stop doing this. So that's the avenue there. And for those who didn't see the Arnold Schwarzenegger video, he talks a little bit about some of his like role models growing up and some Russian bodybuilders and lifters and stuff, and the strength of the Russian people and how they're still loved and this war needs to stop. And he also uh, did a similar thing with Putin where he said, you are leading this, you started it, so you can stop it. I doubt that that's going to work on him, but it was a nice gesture where you're trying to appeal to something about the person to get them to change their mind on something as big as this.
Yeah, I think that's been a kind of common theme over the past maybe 5 years or so. When I don't know what to call it, competition with China, for lack of a better phrase, when that really started to get going during the Trump administration, there was a lot of effort online to try to make sure that people distinguished between the Chinese people and the Chinese government,
Mm.
which is, good. I think that's a very positive approach and healthy approach to that kind of competition. So this is a similar line of reasoning here on the part of Schwarzenegger. So that's good not only in the sense that it tries to ensure people do not become prejudiced against Russians, but like you point out, it's also good in that it kind of it represents a form of outreach. It extends a hand rather than extending a fist,
Mm-hmm.
and it kind of shows people that there is a path back to normality. This isn't just going to be a permanent break. Relations can be restored. There's no inherent reason for animosity between the West and Russia. So, very well crafted message, and yeah, if it can spread around, I think it would be impactful. But I don't know how much it really can spread around, given the restrictions on the internet in Russia. I think I did read that. I read a BBC article about it, and they said that it was spreading widely on Telegram, which I don't think has been banned in Russia yet. But I also don't know how many Russians really use Telegram, so maybe the impact will be limited.
I did see a really cool infographic. It was like an animated thing of arms sales from the US and from the Soviet Union and then Russia to the rest of the world. And it highlights a lot of where the current alliances fall. Like the US has been supplying arms and stuff to its allies for a long time, and the Soviet Union did a similar thing. And if you're looking at, say, the countries who voted in opposition to this war and that kind of thing, the people who have been buying a lot of Russian military goods over the past several decades were less likely to state their discontent with this particular conflict. Some of the big names are China and India, where they're not backing up Russia and helping them out in this, but they're also not like aggressively standing opposed to it. And that kind of goes back to the spheres of influence and that whole wrestling game where people are seeking out alliances, but there are old alliances that have existed for a while, and it's hard to turn someone who's been historically an enemy for you into a friend.
Mhm.
And I
Yeah,
think the US and Russia haven't been friends or at least on the same side in a conflict since World War II.
correct.
Yeah.
Although you could say that they were at least on good terms in the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there was, integration between Russia and the West never really took off the way some of the early optimists would have liked. But yeah, Russian arms exports are definitely a major player in the arms industry. And a lot of their consumers are not really all that interested in cutting off ties, because even if they don't buy further equipment and weapons and vehicles and whatnot, cutting them off would mean cutting off their principal source of maintenance support. And that would obviously be a problem for readiness. We're seeing what happens in Ukraine when you don't take care of your equipment, so getting cut off from your supplier comes with knock-on secondary effects in the form of lower quality maintenance. And that's not what a lot of those guys want. Hypothetically, they could abandon the equipment and buy new equipment, but that would be very, very expensive, and it would require training on new types of equipment, which would also just take a lot of time. So yeah, I don't think India, or well, definitely not China, but I don't think India either is going to refrain from buying weapons from Russia in future. Most likely, the U.S. will even implicitly condone it by giving them an exemption to sanctions, which they've actually done before, back when the United States was trying to pressure countries into abandoning the nuclear deal under the Trump administration. One of the ways they did that is to try to sanction. Well, no, actually, that was the Magnitsky Act I was thinking of. I think that was in response to the Skripal incident, where the Russians poisoned some people with a nerve agent in the UK. So they tried to apply sanctions to countries that imported arms from Russia, and India was one of them. But the US gave an exemption to them. Even though there was kind of an interest in trying to break the relationship, the Indians insisted that they weren't going to break it, regardless of what we did. So rather than do damage to the relationship, we ended up averring and just giving them the exemption. Yeah, I think also it's not just about, more broadly, people outside of Europe and outside of American allies in East Asia. There's not really a lot of interest in the conflict. It's just kind of seen as a European issue. So countries in the Middle East and Africa, maybe to a lesser degree in Latin America, and then Southeast Asia, certainly. People in those places don't really have a dog in the fight, per se.
Yeah.
People may sympathize with Ukraine, but they're not willing to actually do much about it. Most countries are not really even applying sanctions against Russia. So from their perspective, the most important aspect of the conflict is the degree to which it impacts them. And most of that comes in the form of higher energy prices and more expensive food. That to them is a lot more important. And in that sense, there's some aggravation with the West in applying sanctions that disrupt food supplies and energy supplies without consulting them. They just feel this is a European problem and that European actors are just not taking them into consideration, which is not unusual. That's pretty much what they expect, but they don't like it any less. And they like it even less if it impacts their food prices. So the attitude on the part of the greater part of the world outside Europe and North America is that they're just going to sit this one out. Thoughts and prayers to Ukraine, but they're not going to do anything that's actually going to inconvenience them economically.
Yeah, that's another aspect of the sacrifice of war to the common people, where if your country is throwing sanctions at other countries, it's putting pressure on the people of that country, but also of your own country. You are going to have to pay higher prices for stuff just as a citizen, even if you have no stake in the war personally.
Exactly.
If your government decides to get involved, then you are necessarily affected by it.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point at where it becomes hard to really fully invest. I had a picture I was going to show you here. It was just, there's been lots of pictures online of farmers towing Russian equipment. Have you seen some of them?
Yeah.
So I thought this one isn't really any different, but I just thought it was interesting because this particular farmer was towing rockets. He basically found some Grad rockets that were lying around and had been abandoned, and he decided to cart them off. You'd think the Russians would be more careful given their logistical issues and given how important the Grad rocket system is to their front line. Their artillery, their indirect fire is key part of their operations here, but apparently not. And some random trivia for you. The Russian GDP in 2021 was $1.48 trillion, whereas the US defense budget in 2021 was $777.7 billion. So the way it works out is that the US Department of Defense's total budget in 2021 was slightly over half the value of the entire Russian GDP in 2021.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's pretty wild numbers, and it kind of gives you an idea of that just what a disadvantage Russia is here vis-a-vis confrontation with the United States, and that doesn't even get into Europe and their defense budget and their GDP. So the odds are very much stacked against Russia, just in terms of broader competition. You know, they have an advantage in Ukraine since they obviously have the nuclear weapons that they can use to deter intervention. But beyond that, you know, the sheer amount of financial power and weight that can be brought to bear by the West is not something that Russia can even begin to counter. This is kind of a side note, but there are broader implications to the Ukraine conflict as far as the impact on the civilian population. One of them is that a lot of the mines and munitions being expended are going to take years to clean up. And in the meantime, there's probably going to be people who are injured or killed. So that's just an unfortunate aspect of war. It pretty much happens every time there's a war. But that's going to be a problem in Ukraine going forward. Let's see, some other aspects. A lot of children are being traumatized, obviously, especially those caught up in some of the conflict zones. And then there's going to be, obviously, there's going to be rape by soldiers. We can't know for sure just the degree to which it's happening, but I mean, it just kind of always happens in war. You know, it's just invariable that soldiers find themselves in positions of power over civilians who are very vulnerable. And it's not just soldiers, to be fair, you know, I mean, just rapists in general will probably be taking advantage. But also, sort of in the similar category, there's also going to be what's called survival sex. I'm not sure if people have heard of that before, but it's also very common during wars for women who are kind of caught up in the fighting or maybe just dislocated or don't have a means of survival to resort to either prostitution or relationships with soldiers even, in order to try to procure necessary food and shelter. So this could also be a problem not only during the war, but also after the war. If there's a lot of economic dislocation, there may be a lot of women who end up getting trafficked, basically, as a result. And then, of course, PTSD among soldiers and civilians will also be a problem, you know, just for obvious reasons. So there's going to be a lot of assistance that Ukraine is going to need in the post-war era once the war is complete, regardless of the outcome of the conflict. And hopefully the West, if not, you know, the broader world, will be willing to provide assistance in that vein. But that remains to be seen. Oh, okay, we finally made it. So Ukrainian public relations campaign. So the Ukrainian government has been spending a lot of money and energy releasing loads of content about the conflict in order to try to sway Western perceptions and to influence politics in the West. And I have to say, they've been pretty wildly successful. This really has to be one of the more successful public relations campaigns in PR history. So you really have to hand it to them for handling it very well. I don't know if they themselves are doing this on their own initiative, and maybe they just got a really good team, or if maybe they've bought some Western, what would you call them, advisors, let's say, to try to help them out. But regardless, they're getting their money's worth here. So one of the things they're doing is just being prolific on social media. I'm sure everybody on their social media of choice has seen content relating to Ukraine. And, you know, a lot of that is probably user generated, but I would assume that a fair amount of it is also being generated by the Ukrainian government itself. So there's a number of Ukrainian subreddits now, for example. At first, it was pretty much just the Ukraine subreddit that had information. And then there was a live update Twitter news feed on the news subreddit. I still use that. But other than that, there weren't a lot. But now there's a subreddit called Ukraine War Video Report and then Ukraine War. And they're pretty active, uploading content. And I guess, again, those could just be regular people, but I kind of suspect the Ukrainian government is involved there. They also released a lot of Facebook videos and infographics, and there's probably a considerable amount of stuff on Instagram as well. I don't use it, so I don't know, but I'm just assuming here. And they've also been either producing content or sharing content on TikTok relating to the war. And then the case study I had is a new video from Zelensky. Well, not Zelensky, but it's basically a video from the Ukrainian government, and it kind of illustrates how slick their content is. At least I thought it was well made anyway. Let me see if I can post this in your Discord. There we go. And of course, they released it in English because that's the target audience. So let's see, social media. And then another thing they've been doing is having video conferences with legislatures in the West. And this is something that Zelensky himself has been doing. And the idea is basically just to appear before the legislators and make the case sort of personally on a personal level to try to advocate for greater support. And it's worked very well. It's not just that they've come on and shown videos of Ukraine showing all the destruction and whatnot. Zelensky himself and his team have been crafting the message to each country. They've been customizing their message according to each different country whose legislature they talk to. And the way that they've done that is pretty impressive. So when he was talking to the UK, he started quoting Churchill and talking about how they would, fight in the hills, fight on the beaches, etc., to try to appeal to try to make the historical analogy with World War II, but also to appeal to sentiment in Britain. And then when he was talking to the U.S. legislature, the U.S. Congress, he started kind of to tap into the debate about the U.S. role in the U.S. role as a sort of protector of the global order. So he said that it wasn't enough to be the leader of a nation. You have to be a leader of the world. And being leader of the world means that you're a leader of peace. That's me paraphrasing. That's not an exact quote, but that was the gist of it. So that kind of fed into pre-existing debates here about the U.S. and how it needs to kind of fight for its values and stand up for the world order and whatnot. And with Germany, he did a lot of guilt tripping, which is very effective and very popular in Germany. So he brought up World War II and how Germany did a lot of damage in Ukraine and how now it's happening again, and how Germany has an obligation to try to make up for its past by helping Ukraine. And then as a kind of anecdote, I was asking Etche Fatum about the European response, and he made the point that just more generally, Zelensky has done well in trying to paint the conflict as one that's not merely an attack on Ukraine, but also an attack on Europe, an attack on international laws and democracy more broadly. So that's also fed into a lot of pro-West, well, a lot of pro-democracy liberal sentiment in Europe that is inherently favorable to countries standing up to aggression that kind of violates these international norms that Westerners like.
Mm-hmm.
So all told, very effective in crafting their message. And we already talked about the no-fly zone stuff earlier. So yeah, that's the gist of it. I just kind of wanted to point out how effective the campaign had been. And also to kind of tell people to keep in mind that while there's a lot of tear-jerking content and whatnot out there, and while Ukraine does deserve support, keep in mind there's probably some exaggerating happening there, at least to some degree. We already talked about the drama with the jets. Oh, I wanted to share this with you too. This was one of the things the Ukrainians have been doing, just like Ukrainian civilians, is that when they capture looters, they'll tie them up to trees. And what I read is that they were tying them up to trees in areas where there had been shelling or where the Russians had been, basically as punishment. But apparently they've also been whipping them sometimes after tying them up to trees. So I wanted to send that as well. Yeah, this was a man and a woman who were caught looting, and they were tied to a tree, and some babushkas were going to town on them.
Send in the babushkas.
Yeah.
These would be who's stealing? Just anyone?
Yeah, just,
Ukrainian people, Russian people,
the
whatever.
criminal element, let's say. There's always people, regardless of context, regardless of what historical era, regardless of there's always going to be some people that try to take advantage of it and abuse the situation for their own benefit.
Yeah, to a lesser extent, we see this with the protests in the United States and how it can start with either a right leaning or a left leaning protest, and then people, just people of opportunity who are like, hey, there's chaos happening right now. Do you want to break in here and take this shit? Because there's a distraction that's already happening. And they're not really there for the ideology per se, they're there for the loot.
Yeah, exactly. And so punishment of those people tends to be relatively severe, more so than it would be during peacetime. So that video is case in point. Let's see some other notes I had here. Israel is on board with sanctions now. They kind of weren't before. A lot of countries in the Middle East are pretty ambivalent about the whole thing. They don't really want to get wrapped into the whole sanctions regime or the conflict generally. Some of the Gulf states have kind of been pressured by the West to increase oil production. I think I read the other day that they were seriously considering that, so that could provide some relief. But Israel had also been on the fence because they have to do with, well, they have to deal with Russians a lot in Syria because they've been fighting a shadow war against Iranian forces in Syria. But because there's a lot of Russian air assets in Syria, they have to do a lot of deconfliction in order to ensure they don't accidentally end up in a conflict with Russia. So, understandably so. So, for that reason, they've been kind of reluctant to apply sanctions to Russia, but apparently they've decided the risk is worth it. And they've announced anyway that they're not going to be like a third party avenue through which Russia evades global sanctions. Did I talk about Russian GPS last time?
No, you mentioned that they wanted to use 3G, but I don't remember that.
Well, you're familiar with GPS, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So the Russians didn't want to be dependent on GPS because that's Western owned and operated. So they created their own equivalent called GLONASS or GLONASS. I don't remember, but I had kind of assumed that they could use that as a navigation system and with their precision guided munitions. Uh, but apparently, GLONASS does not really work without GPS, which confused the shit out of me because that seems to kind of defeat the whole purpose. But apparently, the way it's set up, there needs to be some interoperability with GPS in order for it to function, and they're not really getting that. So as a result, they've been having to rely on handheld GPS devices, just stuff you can buy off the shelf in order to use as navigation devices. And specifically, the example I saw was pilots. So apparently, they'll just buy Garmin GPS units, and they'll have GPS coordinates where they're supposed to go and drop bombs written down on paper, and they'll take those with them when they fly, and then manually enter the GPS coordinates into the GPS device. And what I was reading is that this is partly why Russian airstrikes have been so inaccurate, especially in cities, because they're not really using precision munitions. They're just going to the general area where the GPS coordinates take them to, and then releasing the weapons. So it's not exactly precision bombing here that they're doing. So that lack of a navigation system that's separate from GPS is kind of biting them in the ass, it seems.
Yeah, that seems like a part of logistics that didn't exist back in World War II, whereas like who controls the internet cables kind of a thing, because that ends up being a huge combat edge. If you're using the enemy's internet cables, they can just look at what's happening there and be like, oh, hey, free information. So yeah, making their own infrastructure there really impromptu, it's probably not going to be the most effective.
Yeah, exactly. So some news I got in the past couple hours. Apparently, VKontakte, which is like Russia's equivalent to Facebook, was hacked. And now there's information about the war in Ukraine that is very much not in keeping with censorship laws, to put it mildly, that is making the rounds on Russian social media. So whether that makes any kind of impact or difference remains to be seen. But I did think that was worth mentioning since there is kind of a broader hacker war going on.
Hmm.
Anonymous announced that there was a war with Russia, and there's a number of other groups, I'm sure, that have been actively trying to hack Russian networks and cause trouble for them. And as a kind of open question here, and this is a question I, ask to chat and anybody listening and, to whom it may concern, just more broadly, a kind of meta question. What kind of future would Russia be able to build for itself with Ukraine? That is to say, successfully meeting its objectives in Ukraine, that it can't build for itself without achieving those goals. Because I don't feel like there's really much there, having thought about it. Like economically, it's not going to change anything, even if they succeeded. Politically, doesn't really change anything. National security, some gains in national security, but that's been way overblown, I feel. So really, what is this war for? Like, what do they get long term out of it?
It looks better on the map
Yeah, I guess there's that.
because if you're thinking about Putin and when he grew up, the Soviet Union had way more just map area, and Ukraine is pretty large by landmass compared to a lot of other smaller European countries, so that gives them a big chunk. It does end up being kind of silly because Ukraine is already not a part of NATO and it's not a part of CSTO, so it's sort of de facto neutral. It can self-determine, but it's been edging west over the past few decades. They had that puppet president who was very favorable to Russia for a bit, but then with Zelensky being very, very pro-West, it seems like they want to join NATO, and that's more of where the dialogue is, at least for the government that was voted on.
Mhm.
So that would be a way of, by force, pulling it back into the Russian sphere of influence, as opposed to just by persuasion, which was the other route. And that seems to be what the U.S. has mainly done. Like a lot of people who are browsing this Russian propaganda news, and some people in the chat were talking about the information in China that's going around. A lot of it is blaming the U.S. for this. And it's just the
Mhm.
U.S. has been aggressive around the world. Why can't Russia do something in the world as well? As far as I can tell, our efforts so far have been providing aid and then encouraging people to take the democratic route of things. I think that's something that the U.S. is very happy to do, is if there's a government or a group of people who want to have fair and free elections and do stuff our way, then we're pretty quick to throw money at that problem to support them. But yeah, it's a big question mark too with sovereignty, because even if Russia wins, does the world acknowledge that with sovereignty? Like many countries still don't recognize the annexation of Crimea as a valid play.
Yeah, exactly.
So if they take Ukraine by force, then many countries are going to say, hey, well, that wasn't very cool. They should still be allowed to have their home, kind of a thing.
Hmm. Yeah, that's I guess that would be my own perspective on it. Like the world will reject it, the people in Ukraine will reject it.
Mm-hmm.
Like best case best case scenario, you set up a puppet government that people are immediately going to try to overthrow, which means the only way it's going to stick is if you set up a authoritarian repressive government to try to keep them in line. And that isn't really going to be viable long term. I mean, if you want to play the what about game, which people on the internet love to do, you can say that the United States has overthrown governments and installed puppet governments to ensure that they are pro-Western.
Mm-hmm.
But the United States never really did it like this. I mean, the closest parallel would be the Iraq War. But in the Cold War, when the United States was trying to ensure countries in Latin America stayed on side, what we would do is ally with the right wing of the political spectrum in those countries. I don't think there were any cases where we just engineered a whole ass coup or revolution from nothing. We pretty much always worked with pre-existing political groups that already wanted to overthrow the government or to have more control or to suppress communism or the left more generally. As I'm sure people in Latin America will tell you, there's definitely a virulent strain of anti-union, anti-communist conservatism in Latin America that never needed any American help in order to, be anti-union or anti-communist. They were inherently so.
Mm.
We just energized them and worked with them to ensure they were in control of the countries so that we didn't have to worry about them. So that's sort of the smarter way to do it. All right, you work with groups that are already on the ground. Russia could have done that in Ukraine, and I'm kind of surprised they didn't. One of the confusing things about the conflict is why they didn't go that route. I mean, I've said before on here that there's no reason Russia couldn't invade Ukraine. I've been saying that for years, but they never really did. So I just kind of assumed that they were going to do the influence approach, right? Sort of the subterfuge, covert assisting local elites that are sort of more on your side, that route. And I kind of feel like part of the reason maybe they ended up going the military route is because the covert route wasn't really working. And the reason it wasn't working is because they mismanaged it, right? They were just, I mean, you can't invade Crimea and set up separatist republics and then expect there not to be a response. And then if you expect, and then, when you deal with the response, you can't just continue to be heavy handed.
Mm-hmm.
So, part of the problem is that the whole invasion of Crimea was just the wrong way to do it in the first place. And I guess to be fair, maybe that put them in a corner where military options were really the only options. But even so, I would have thought that slow wins the race, right? Like the Ukrainians were never going to push them out of Crimea. They weren't going to push them out of the separatist republics. So surely they could have just supported, agitprop in Ukraine, especially eastern Ukraine, and eventually maybe brought down the government and maybe even gotten a pro-Russian government elected legitimately. You said before that there was a Russian puppet in Ukraine before Zelensky, but that's not really true. Yanukovych was the guy who was in charge before and during Euromaidan. And he was genuinely popular in the east of the country amongst the ethnic Russian population, and probably not a few people in other parts of the country as well. So it's not that he was a puppet per se, it's more just that he was representing a very pro-Russian part of the population. And the reason the protests started was just because he kind of went back on his own word, because even amongst the pro-Russian population, they still wanted to try to integrate to some degree with the European Union. That was a pretty popular position even with that group. And then he changed his mind and scuppered the association agreement he was set to sign after meeting with representatives of the Russian government. So it's not that he was a puppet, it's just that he, was subject to immense influence from Russia that he didn't feel that he could resist. And that's where the trouble started.
This has raised a lot of criticism of U.S. involvement in the past as well, which to an extent is whataboutism. To another extent, these are fair conversations to have. Similar to how we distinguish between the Russian regime and their decision to go to war versus the Russian citizens and their opinion on it, the American citizens as well are not as though, like, all the stuff that we did interfering with countries and backing up dictators and things like this, if you ask most people and you explained what happened there, they would agree that that was kind of a fucked up thing to do. So yeah, that's a big part of just being honest with situations. Like, the world doesn't have 100% clear good guys and bad guys where this country is always the good guy and this country is always the bad guy. People get involved into some really murky waters, and basically anyone who's even in that situation is going to have some amount of blood on their hands. So that makes it really difficult to talk about, I think, when you can talk about the invasion of Ukraine and you can take issue with that, and then people say, well, what about the US and the stuff that they've done? Those are valid conversations, and maybe it's good to have them, like, in a response to this, just so we're holding ourselves accountable as well. But man, if it's so messy, and it seems like it's so few people who make the decision to go to war. Like, how many people in number do you think were a part of Russia's decision to invade Ukraine, or the US to interfere in some country in South America decades ago? It wasn't like it was a mass agreed upon thing. A huge block of these countries just don't even care. They're not invested at all. They don't have a stake in the game.
Yeah. Uh, going by that FSB whistleblower letter, and I might add he's actually released additional letters since then. I don't think we'll have time to get to them, but uh, one of the things he pointed out is that, well, one of the things he asserted, let's say, is that the government had not really told anybody about what it was going to do. Like, it seems the planning was restricted to like the very top of the government, like specific individual elites were planning on doing it, but nobody in the military was told. Nobody in their intelligence community was told. It was just sort of sprung on them at the last minute. And that suggests that it was probably either something Putin himself planned or something one of his immediate entourage wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I read in a Twitter thread from an analyst is that Putin himself kind of has a decision-making process wherein he just kind of takes suggestions from people. Actually, I think this was in the FSB letter too. The FSB whistleblower suggested that Putin himself just doesn't say no to suggestions. Like his entourage will propose policies to him and he'll just say yes on the condition that the people proposing be put in charge of it and take responsibility if things go wrong. So for him, it's not really a risky endeavor to indulge some of these requests from his entourage. Like if some elite in his network wants to do something, sure, why not? But if you fuck it up, it's going to be you that gets screwed over.
Yeah.
It's not going to be me.
Sir, can I do this crazy idea? Yes, but if it goes south, it's your head. Oh. I guess
Yeah,
that
so
would mean they're less likely to propose just any old thing because it'll fall to them if it goes awry.
Well, it depends on how dumb they are.
True.
Obviously, somebody thought invading Ukraine would be smart. So apparently, not the brightest cohort up there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, part of the reason that this operation was cleared by Putin, among probably others, may not so much be because he himself really wanted to do it, but rather because somebody else wanted to do it and basically just agreed to take responsibility for it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's going to be enough to deflect, you know, popular discontent against Putin in this case, because in this case, the screw up is sufficiently big that no one person can really be held responsible, or at least Putin himself cannot really avoid at least some culpability.
Yeah.
So I don't think that traditional approach is going to work. But as far as how it came to pass in the first place, that could well be how it happened.
Mm-hmm.
That could also be the reason Putin had that weird thing where he was on TV with his intelligence head and was kind of pressuring him to try to show that he supported the operation. Maybe that was Putin's way of trying to show that it wasn't him alone that was responsible for this, it was other people as well.
Yeah, you can't just go to war as one. It does seem like he has created an atmosphere in the room around him that is sufficiently scary enough that taking a hard line against him and really speaking out against him is not really on the table for them, because in that case it's their head, at least in this extent that they lose their post. And before we started tonight's Agent Smith, I was talking a little bit about free speech and how, yeah, you can complain about getting banned on a social media platform in the US, but we have been allowed for many years, and I have many fond memories of people actively bashing the president loudly in public and not going to jail for that. And how that's a freedom that many of us agree we should have. You should be able to say if your leader, president, prime minister does some dumb shit, you should be able to critique that and criticize that, because that's part of the diversity of the people in the country. We're not all just beholden to one figurehead leader and everything they do is the best idea ever. Mistakes are made, and being able to state your discontent is a really big part in shifting the momentum in the other direction, and also pointing to, for the next administration, hey, we really didn't like this thing that was done. They have a sort of roadmap, or at least a list of what not to do leading into their period in office.
Very useful mechanisms for exactly those reasons.
Mm.
Yeah, even during the Iraq War, which is the closest corollary to this war in Ukraine, uh, people still criticize the government
Mm-hmm.
quite vociferously, as I recall. the internet was particularly brutal.
Yeah, the George W. Bush got kind of the reputation for being a dumb cowboy who didn't really know what was going on and shot first and asked questions later. And yeah, the left was very not pleased with his decision to get entangled over there, and it was very expensive for people as well. So, yep, there are definitely critics of government, and that's a really important thing to do. Being able to have a healthy disagreement with people is also good too. I was watching some stuff that was connecting the Russian involvement in U.S. elections and the hacking which released Hillary's emails and stuff with the desire to put the U.S. off balance by sending trolls and bots and things to amp up the division between the left and the right in the U.S. And it's tough to tell like the size of their effect on that because we don't have control of. Okay, now let's see the 2010s without their influence and see if there's any difference. I think we're going to fight each other to some extent, but how loudly we've been opposed to each other, I think has been a pretty major roadblock. We did have the one thing, if we can talk about a non-Ukraine thing for 2 seconds, the voting on daylight savings. Did you see anything about that? I think that was one of the first things in a bit that's had unanimous vote.
Well, I mean, that's kind of a technical thing. There's actually a lot of technical matters in Congress that get bipartisan support. They just don't get reported because they're super boring. So,
Ah.
so there is bipartisanship in Congress still,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not those things that people focus on. People focus on the sexy things like, the budget, for example, for which
Mm.
there's always like a big battle, or major foreign policy stuff, or domestic policy stuff. Impeaching the president, for example. It's the big ticket stuff that people focus on, and that kind of gives them a warped image of politics. Most legislation that gets passed in Congress actually does get passed with pretty decent majorities, frequently bipartisan. And it's kind of the same problem we have with the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court is in the news, it's because there's something that's like really controversial, a really controversial case that they're overseeing. But most cases that reach the Supreme Court are not that controversial.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the rulings that the Supreme Court issues are, I don't want to say bipartisan per se, but there's generally not much dissent. There will maybe like one of them that dissents or something. So generally, it's pretty rare, relatively speaking, to have court cases where the judges rule according to their supposed partisan alignments.
Mm-hmm.
So similar dynamic.
So
Did you?
it turns out government people do agree on boring shit.
Yeah. But it's not the boring stuff that, gets people excited or that's going to change the world or what have you.
I think
So,
many people are grumpy about daylight savings, especially every spring. I know that I dislike it. You lose an hour of sleep, no one wants that. Gaining an hour
yeah,
of sleep is fun. So if we could do that multiple times and not the other part, I might be keen. But
yeah.
it is annoying too when not all of the whole world does it. So they have to adjust and you have to communicate some archaic thing to them of like, by the way, we're going to treat time differently for a few months. So just
Mhm.
be aware that we're going to be an hour early or late to everything for that period of time.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had that problem myself with some of my clients over in the Far East.
Hmm. Yep. You think you're on time, but your country is doing some weird shit.
Or vice versa.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's them.
Yep.
They'll call you early, thinking it's the right time when it's not. Although I guess from their perspective, it's pretty much the same. So maybe that's being unfair. Depends on whose time you're scheduling in, basically. But did you hear about the Russian journalist Ovsyanikova? She was the one who had that poster, held up that poster during a live broadcast.
Yeah, I think I saw that.
Yeah, she got quite a bit of attention as a result. Don't think there's much more to that story. It's just another example of anti-war sentiment manifesting. And I don't think it'll change anybody's opinion, really, but worth mentioning. It's a ballsy move on her part.
Yeah, it does mean a lot too when you're doing it through state media. And there was also a mass walkout thing that happened for a different news organization.
Rain TV,
Yeah.
I believe it was. That was one of the few what would you call it? Anti-government media organizations in Russia. Yeah, Rain TV and Echo Moskvy, I think were the other ones. I think there's also one called Medusa, but I think that's actually based outside Russia.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was another one, but it's slipping my mind. But anyway, they've pretty much all been banned at this point. And yeah, Rain TV on their last day had a big walkout, and then they played hell, what was it? It was that ballet music, Swan something. Chat. Oh, I forgot. I should do the usual disclaimer. Yeah, now is a good time for the usual disclaimer. I should have done it before. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I'm painfully obvious at times. So if I ever say anything that's wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. I blanked out. If I'm wrong about something,
You
I
don't
want to
read
know more
chat while we
debatably.
do this.
I
If
don't
you
read
have
chat
any
while we do this, but I don't.
if you have
Yeah.
any corrections and if he's wrong, he wants to know more than anybody. So feel free to
Yes.
share. We're not a couple of firebrand pundits who are telling you how to think. We're just some regular people who are trying to comprehend the news. So
Yes.
viewer discussion is encouraged. See, I'm remembering some of it.
Yeah, just let me squeeze that in here right at the end for completion's sake. But yeah, see, I knew that would happen. That totally pushed out whatever it
Swan
was I
Lake.
was going to say.
Swan Lake.
Swan Lake, thank you. That's what it was.
Good job, chat.
Yeah, they played the music from that as a kind of reference because that was played. Well, apparently it was played several times during the Soviet Union whenever there was a major crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't know exactly what the logic was behind it, but basically, for example, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they played that on TV. And I believe when the coup tried to overthrow Gorbachev, that was also played on TV then.
Hmm.
And I think when Brezhnev died, they also played it on TV at that time.
And they played it for what moment this time?
When the opposition news channel shut down on their last day when they had the walkout, they played
Oh.
that on their channel as a kind of subtle reference.
Mm-hmm. They were forced to shut down?
Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah, all of the opposition channels have been by now.
Hmm. Yeah, I was in the Putin documentary. There was like during his initial rise and when he got the presidency, there was some TV show with a bunch of puppets that was like making fun of just people in politics and whatever. And they had a puppet of Putin, and he ended up getting that show shut down because he really didn't like the way he was portrayed in it. It didn't fit with his image of what his optics should be like.
Huh. And that was a Russian show?
Yeah, it was a Russian show. It was just a private organization. This was talking about before it was all state-run post-Soviet Union. There were just some news organizations where they just make their shows and make their news and whatever, and maybe we make fun of the president, kind of like Saturday Night Live will make fun of Trump or Biden or whatever. But, yeah. It was a thing.
Interesting. Well, I don't know how much time we have left. I'm probably running over by now. But do we have time to squeeze in a few more?
Sure.
So one thing I wanted to do, uh, Putin kind of went after people who were leaving the country. He said that they were having their mind. He said that they had their minds in the West and were trying to be a part of some perceived higher caste. And he also asserted that there were fifth columnists in Russia trying to destroy the nation.
What does a fifth columnist mean?
Yeah, it's like somebody who's a traitor, somebody trying to overthrow the government in favor of some outside force. During the Cold War, fifth columnists in the United States, well, during the Cold War, it was assumed that communists were actively trying to overthrow the government on behalf of the Soviet Union, and so they were frequently called fifth columnists.
Mm-hmm.
So Putin here seems to be signaling that he's going to crack down more, or at least a lot of liberals in Russia interpreted his statement to be evidence that he's going to crack down significantly more in Russia on anti-government and anti-war expressions, if not against liberalism generally in the country. So that's something to keep an eye on. Also, I thought this was just kind of funny. Let's see. The Kremlin spokesman said that it was, quote, unacceptable and unforgivable, end quote, that Biden had called Putin a war criminal. And he counters by saying that America is the real war criminal.
No, you!
Yeah. Prototypical deflection there.
I am rubber, you are glue. Whatever you say bounces off of me and sticks to you. I learned that in first grade.
Yep.
It's important.
Have you considered joining the Russian diplomatic corps?
That's their doctrine at the top when you walk in the door.
Let's see. And, okay, we don't have time for the letters, and we don't have time for sanctions. I'm still working on those. And we don't have time to do other stuff. Somebody in chat was saying they wanted to try to look at the rest of the world because there has been stuff going on. But we're not going to have time for that. But I'll just sneak in one more thing here. China is not going to come to Russia's rescue here. If they do, they might provide some clandestine support, maybe military supplies, maybe MREs or something like that. But it's unlikely that they're going to be like a source of investment sufficient to replace Western investment, or to be a market for Russian goods sufficient to undo the damage from the lack of access to Western markets. And Chinese tech firms are not going to come in and try to replace probably the Western firms for the most part. You know, the issue is that a lot of tech firms in China, as well as just industries in general, have ties to the West. You know, they get software from the West needed to run their machinery, or they import machinery itself that they use from the West, or what have you. You know, there's different linkages in their supply chains that interconnect with the West, and they would be putting those supply links at risk if they violate Western sanctions by selling to this, that, or the other Russian firm, you know, depending on the sanctions in question. And so as a result, a lot of Chinese firms are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand, the Chinese government might put pressure on them to invest in Russia or trade with Russia, but at the same time, it would do a lot of damage to their business. And so it seems likely that Chinese businesses are going to probably stay out of the Russian market for the most part, at least the ones that have connections to the West. And those are the ones that generally are producing the kinds of things like tech gadgets and other equipment that Russia is going to want to buy to replace Western equipment. So it could be that the Chinese government just surprises me and goes hard here and really pushes their industry to break with the West completely and help Russia, but I don't think that would really fit in with their overarching strategic plans. You know, they're a lot more interested in trying to maintain, you know, the most important sensitive ties to the West, so that they can continue to modernize their industry, so that they can become less dependent over the long term. Breaking with the West right now isn't going to help them do that. And China has shown before that they're not willing to make sacrifices of their long-range strategic plan to become, you know, a relatively modern, self-sufficient economy, almost regardless of the cost. And I don't think throwing Russia under the bus is going to be a cost they're not willing to pay to pursue that. Mm-hmm. Also, Russia really has not helped their case here by basically promising Xi Jinping that the war would be short and victorious, and that it wouldn't be any problem at all, and then having it just totally turn into, well, a problem, shall we say.
Quagmire.
Yeah. So the Chinese government probably doesn't appreciate that, especially since they came out on the first day and said that, you know, they totally backed the Russians and were with them through thick and thin, all with the assumption that they wouldn't actually have to do anything. So now they actually do have to do something, and they don't really appreciate it. So I expect that they're not going to be entirely pleased about the way things have played out, and they're probably not going to provide all of the support they're asking for. Some, yes, but not enough to really fully bail them out. You know, the whole thing is just turning into a, you know, Mussolini's invasion of Greece situation, you know, where he invades Greece thinking it's an easy operation, and then the Greeks not only defeat his army, but start pushing it back into Albania, to the point where he has to beg Hitler to come and bail him out. So I don't think China, as the role of Germany in this analogy, is going to be quite so accommodating as Hitler. not least because Hitler felt he had to invade in order to ensure the Allies didn't get a beachhead on his southern flank. China doesn't really have the same concerns here. So there's not nearly the strategic imperative, I feel, for China to get involved more than it already is.
Yeah, the main thing that people have been mentioning in the chat is that if China supports Russia in this, it makes it look more favorable for them to make a play at Taiwan. Like if they agree that it's acceptable to integrate a neighbor is how they might pitch it to themselves, where they were kind of one of us all along. We're just roping them in and helping them out and improving them and updating them to our better ways of doing things, kind of a thing. So if they look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine and they say, yeah, that's fine, then it makes their play look less evil, less aggressive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have the benefit of a different context because, Taiwan exists as a product of the Chinese Civil War. Vatueo was right about that. So they can kind of claim that it's not really invading the sovereign nation. They can say that it's just concluding the Civil War, so to speak. So that technically would be true. I don't think the technicality would matter much in influencing the Western response, which is what they're going to be more focused on. But yeah, in terms of narrative, yeah, they have that benefit of having a different context to work with. But yeah, unfortunately, we're not going to have time here to get to the other stuff. Lots of goings on. The United States has its first African American Supreme Court justice who looks set to be confirmed, most likely. So that'll be pretty exciting. There's a shadow war going on in the Middle East. I mentioned it earlier, but there's been some more violence there happening. The Iran nuclear deal is still being negotiated, so there's been progress there. The Russians have tried to sabotage it, not very successfully, but we'll see.
African American female justice.
Oh, right. Sorry. Yeah, that's right. I forgot about Thomas. Clarence Thomas, I think, was the first one.
Yeah, and he's still in.
Is he? I keep forgetting he's still alive.
He is. He's been in the news recently because his wife is in a bunch of fringe stuff.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, that's...
She was at the protest, the January 6th protest.
Yeah. Insurrection.
Insurrection. There you go. Now, what was the euphemism I had? No, I used assailants. That's what it was. But yeah, I guess I had just been going with protest or insurrection or what have you. Well, anyway, yeah, she was involved with that.
Well, there were technically people who just showed up and just protested and left, but specifically being clear that the people who broke in, smashed stuff, and defiled offices, that was insurrection.
Yeah, agreed. But yeah, that was pretty wild to hear that, she just kind of was there. That's not what I would expect of the wife of a Supreme Court justice.
We're getting another correction here. Clarence Thomas was not the first. Thurgood Marshall was the first person of color in the Supreme Court.
1950s. So what did Clarence Thomas do? Was he the first of anything, or am I just misremembering the whole issue?
Maybe. Yeah, Thurgood Marshall.
He's right. I do remember Thurgood Marshall now that he mentions it.
He used the courts to fight Jim Crow and dismantle segregation in the U.S.
Yeah, that was back in the 50s.
Cool.
But Clarence Thomas didn't do any of that. I don't know. Maybe he wasn't really famous for anything. Maybe he was just a conservative justice. Yeah, my memory isn't cooperating, so I couldn't tell you.
All good.
Well, other stuff that we can't really talk about, there was a big development in Indian politics. One of their sort of more liberal opposition parties got control of a state in a recent election. So that's pretty exciting for them. Colombia could probably have a left-wing president soon. He's leading in the polls, so that would be a big development. a lot of maneuvering in U.S. politics right now. I'll kind of skip over that. Uh, oh, did you want to see the footage of the rats in Australia?
That sounds gross. What is it?
Well, in Australia, rats don't really have a lot of natural predators, right?
Mm-hmm.
So whenever there's an infestation, an explosion in the population, it can really get out of control, like to an extreme degree. And so there was some video on Reddit that I thought really kind of illustrated it really well, just how bad the infestations could get. Let's see, there was some Chinese espionage that was going on in the U.S. Some people were arrested as part of that. And oh yeah, there's some big ass COVID lockdowns over in China as well. Probably not going to do their economy any favors, but maybe it'll put some downward pressure on oil prices at least.
Where was it? I haven't heard about it. I'm glad that you're safe, TLRE, from this. I linked it in the chat. Oh my gosh. What do you do against this? I got it. Send in the cats. Get an elite team of 4,000 super hungry, very skilled combat cats.
You would need a lot. Yeah, I think poison is the main way.
Poisonous cats.
Yeah. Well, when they had a similar outbreak of rabbits in Australia, which happens sometimes as well, they actually went in the 1990s and developed basically a bioweapon. They tried to introduce this type of disease into the population that was contagious, and that actually wiped out like 95% or something like that of the rabbits in Australia.
Whoa.
So pretty effective. Yeah, they don't hold back in Australia.
It's reminding me of when we were talking about the plagues and they were sending in ducks to fight it. It's the little kid in you loves those kind of stories.
Yeah. Sorry we didn't get to the other stuff, but there's always lots of stuff going on with Ukraine that I kind of want to highlight and update people on.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to do all of it, but I'm never sure like what is like the most interesting or relevant. So, if people want to give feedback, as to what aspects of these Ukraine updates are the most useful or interesting, I can kind of narrow things down a little bit and focus more on those instead of giving these sort of shotgun big picture looks that incorporate a lot of different elements.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate you helping us cover it. We could either do other countries at the beginning or the end, because I would still guess that the Ukraine war is going to dominate most of people's news cycles who watch my stream, which is going to be Europe and the US and so on. But thank you, chat, for helping us out, providing your feedback and some corrections here and there. If you have any feedback in the YouTube comments, feel free to do that. We can look at those and maybe address some stuff on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Always a privilege.
Appreciate you, sir, and we will see you on the next.
Yep, see you next time.
GG.